All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. William Shakespeare, As You Like It, Act 2, Scene 7. And so true. Life often feels like a big game, doesn't it? Like we're putting on a show for some celestial audience. William Shakespeare said that over 4 centuries ago. He lived from 1564 to 1616, and man, did that dude leave a legacy behind. One that has survived and influenced everything and everyone from future playwrights, authors, people who write for TV and movies and more for over 400 years. His words continue to help all of us understand the human condition to this day, to realize that while our world has improved tremendously when it comes to industry, medicine, technology, and more, it's changed in so many ways. We are still, in a lot of ways, no different from many of Shakespeare's characters. We still have ambition that gets us into trouble, unrequited romance that emotionally leaves us gutted. We still have people we thought were our friends who betray us, and on and on. Shakespeare captured the universal human experience so very well, and thus his words still ring true today. And they still will, 1,000 years from now. Shakespeare is considered England's national poet and one of the greatest playwrights and authors of all time. Many of us probably associate Shakespeare mostly with high school memories of reading plays out loud in class and poorly written essays we wrote the night before. And most of us probably did not ever spend any time trying to get to know Shakespeare the man. Shakespeare was a country boy in the small yet bustling town of Stratford-upon-Avon. He received a standard education and never attended university. He got married at the age of 18, and after the birth of his twins, he disappeared from the historical records for 7 long years, and then re-emerged in the London theater scene as both an actor and playwright. An incredibly talented superstar in the making. Soon after his re-emergence, Shakespeare became a shareholder in an acting company known as Lord Chamberlain's Men, later renamed the King's Men. With Shakespeare's plays and some of London's most popular actors, the Lord Chamberlain's Men became the most successful, one of the most successful, if not the most successful, companies of its day. Audiences were captivated by Shakespeare's tragedies, histories, and comedies that artfully captured the struggle of the human condition, romance, war, politics, betrayal, family conflict, vaulting ambition, and so much more. Shakespeare was a beloved figure, well known to many in London and the surrounding areas, and his life and his popularity has only soared since his death. He's long been one of the most recognizable names in the world, thanks largely to his friends putting together the first folio, a collection of his plays. Without that, we might not have any copies of Shakespeare's plays today, which is insane to think about. His works could have easily been lost to history, just like so much of his actual life was. We know so little about William Shakespeare the man, but so much so that some scholars actually don't think he was a real person. They think that some Elizabethan contemporary wrote the plays and poems we attribute now to Shakespeare and took on a pen name to hide their identity for various reasons, depending on the suspected real author. This week, I will share what we do know about the life of William Shakespeare and some of his most famous works. We'll meet some of his contemporaries, a few friends and rivals, and discuss the anti-Stratfordian theory, the theory that William did not write his plays, and also, and you're not going to find this almost anywhere else other than here, some true crime speculation. Was William Shakespeare, was he a serial killer known as Billy Shakes? All this and more in another literary. How much did William Shakespeare influence the stories we continue to create and consume today and the very language us English speakers use to make and manage our lives edition of Timesuck?
This is Michael McDonald, and you're listening to Timesuck.
You're listening to Timesuck.
Well, happy Monday, meat sacks, and welcome to the Cult of the Curious. I'm Dan Cummins, the master sucker, Dick Quest's meth dealer, Jerry Brudos' shoe cobbler, and you are listening to Timesuck. Hail Nimrod, hail Lucifina, praise be to Bojangles, good boy Bojangles, and glory be to Triple M. And if I, have a little awkward pauses in today's show, I just have one of those little head colds. It's not that big of a deal, but it just makes you feel a little spacey, almost like you're a little bit high all the time. So that's where I'm at right now. I don't feel that bad. Just a little bit foggy. But I think we're going to have a fun show, nonetheless. I got some cool new free stuff I want to announce at the start of the show. Who doesn't like free stuff? And then we're off into the bulk of the show. Starting off with excited to bring back an old favorite, something that we missed last year, something I really missed doing, the 2023 Bad Magic Street Team. Street Team is back. Let's get some fucking stickers stuck all over the place. Stickers are going to be available on Wednesday, August 2nd, noon Pacific time. We'll have 500 packs of 10 available to ship out, and the sticker packs are free. You only have to pay for shipping. And since they're free, please limit your purchase to 1 pack so more of you can get in on the fun. We're not going to do more than 500 packs this year. Hopefully they'll be gone pretty quick, and they'll be available badmagicmerch.com Wednesday, August 2nd at noon Pacific time. Stick them all over the place, wherever you feel comfortable, on your forehead, your neighbor's forehead, your butthole, your neighbor's butthole, that cool spot in the record shop bathroom where everyone puts stickers, somebody's butthole in that bathroom. I remember in past years finding them on hiking trails, ski lifts, rest stop stalls, fucking garbage cans out in sidewalks, wherever, just all over the place. It was super fun. And then post pics of where you put the stickers. Get creative. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, little videos, static images, whatever. And then hashtag it with Bad Magic Street Team so we can find it. And you can tag us in the photos. Thanks for helping us get the word out about our show. It's about time we started to, try to grow again. Been too long. Been going week to week for too long here. The contest will last October 2nd, noon Pacific time, and we'll look up posts based on the hashtag in October. And the winner, whoever we think did the best job putting stickers all over the place, is going to get $200 in a badmagicmerch.com store credit. And then mark your calendar, Sunday, August 27th at 4 p.m., the debut of my newest stand-up special, Trying to Get Better. Recorded back in Minneapolis this past December, finally releasing it as is the current trend for most comics, for free on YouTube. We self-produced it. Thankfully, actually own this thing so I can post clips on socials later and not get fucking trademark and copyright strikes on my own shit. I'll be there in the comment feed for the initial release on August 27th, that Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific time. Hopefully watching it along with a lot of you. Hope you like it. If you do like it, please just tell your friends to also watch it. I had a great time doing it. My buddy Mike O'Dare directed it. I think he did an awesome job, and I'm proud of how it turned out. If you don't like it, I am just not fucking capable of making you laugh, because it's the best I can do. Again, Sunday, August 27th, 4 p.m. on the Bad Magic Productions YouTube channel, the new special, Trying to Get Better, about an hour and 20 minutes long. And then I'll be working on new material in Spokane at the Spokane Comedy Club this weekend, August 4th and 5th. And now one more cool free thing happened at the end of this episode. Free professional advice. Not advice from me, professional mental health advice that I'm just relaying, just the messenger. Since this show started, and thanks to the vocal community that has grown up around it, I've become an advocate for mental health, gone back to what I used to study, psychology. It's something each and every one of us deals with. I often don't feel qualified to give the right advice, though. But recently I was lucky enough to be able to partner with BetterHelp for an occasional special edition of Timesucker Updates, where I'll share some insight and advice given to me to give to you by a licensed therapist. And all of this advice is based on questions we receive from many of you meat sacks. So thank you for sharing what you were curious about. And again, that will be after today's story at the end of the episode. Right now, let us get theatrical. We simply must head to the theater. Post haste. So how am I laying out today's show? For our first order of infotainment business, we'll talk about the theatrical world of Shakespeare's day and place, the Elizabethan theater. After that, I'll present a brief overview of Shakespeare's famous writing style, a full timeline of what we know about his life, including some very disturbing true crime speculation. It's pretty grisly shit. Followed by an explanation of the anti-Stratfordian theory, the theory that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare. Before all that, real quick, the very first order of business today. Why does Shakespeare matter at all? Why do we care about his plays and his poetry? Who cares about Willie? And the answer is, most of us don't fucking care, because we're not Renaissance fair fucking nerds. Most of us, in all honesty, I know I said something different up top, but honestly, most of us don't give a fuck about William Shakespeare, and we find the theater in general, including all the stupid plays he wrote, to be super fucking boring. Most of us actually like cool shit, like sex, or putting up a new personal record on the bench press, or streaming some show on an awesome new 70-inch plasma, some show full of fucking bad guys getting blasted by alpha males and tons of hot titties being flashed on screen. Most of us like getting our dicks wet and getting drunk and high and not being a fucking dork. JK, that was way too aggressive. I think most people who don't like the theater do still at least acknowledge Shakespeare is pretty cool. Come on, admit it. And even if they don't, much of the media, they do watch has been influenced by Shakespeare in some way. You can make the argument that essentially all modern storytelling has a little Shakespeare in it. According to the now online Encyclopedia Britannica, a place providing a succinct summary that seems to share some of the same sentiments that many other publications believe, Shakespeare remains vital because his plays present people in situations that we recognize today. His characters have an emotional reality that transcends time, and his plays depict familiar experiences, ranging from family squabbles to falling in love to war. The fact that his plays are performed and adapted around the world underscores the universal appeal of his storytelling. Shakespeare's contemporary, fellow poet and dramatist Ben Jonson wrote that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. And Benny Boy fucking nailed it. It's insane that over 400 years after his death, nearly the entirety of Shakespeare's body of work is still being reproduced. Successfully, to packed houses, every year on stages around the world and continuously adapted to TV, film, and more. You cannot say that for literally any other author from Shakespeare's day or from before his day. Shakespeare truly stands alone in the longevity of his immense success, especially when you think about the entirety of his catalog. John Russell Brown, arguably the world's leading Shakespeare scholar for decades before his death in 2015 at the age of 91, wrote, "It may be audacious even to attempt a definition of his greatness, but it is not so difficult to describe the gifts that enabled him to create imaginative visions of pathos and mirth that, whether read or witnessed in the theater, fill the mind and linger there. He is a writer of great intellectual rapidity, perceptiveness, and poetic power. Other writers have had these qualities, but with Shakespeare, the keenness of mind was applied not to abstruse or remote subjects, but to human beings and their complete range of emotions and conflicts. Other writers have applied their keenness of mind in this way, but Shakespeare is astonishingly clever with words and images, so that his mental energy, when applied to intelligible human situations, finds full and memorable expression, convincing and imaginatively stimulating. As if this were not enough, the art form into which his creative energies went was not remote and bookish, but involved the vivid stage of impersonation of human beings, commanding sympathy and inviting vicarious participation. Thus, Shakespeare's merits can survive translation into other languages and into cultures remote from that of Elizabethan England. That is why he still matters. Universal relevance, baby. He wrote plays that brought audiences to tears or had them laughing out loud back in the late 16th century, and those same plays still bringing people to tears, still making people laugh over 4 centuries later. Who else, at least in the Western world, can claim that? Sophocles, right, the ancient Greek playwright who wrote in the 5th century BCE, a full 2 millennia before Shakespeare's time. We do still perform a few of his plays today, right? Mostly Oedipus Rex. But we don't perform all of them regularly anymore. And I would say the effect they have is more historically interesting than it is like emotionally appealing today. Not that it doesn't have still some emotional weight. And he's not quoted nearly as often or studied as thoroughly as Shakespeare. Also for us here in America and in any other nation where the primary language is English, no other writer from before, during, or after Shakespeare's time who wrote in English has been as heralded as much as he is. He really is the GOAT, right? It's fucking crazy how relevant he still is. Widely regarded as the greatest writer in the history of the English language. If he wrote what is attributed to him, which again we will get into later. As someone who in a sense has made a living as a writer nearly his entire adult life, I am blown away by Shakespeare's talent. In stand-up comedy, it is so much easier to put on a well-received show if you rely on pop culture references or whatever is trendy, right? Follow the trends like crowd work right now, whatever it is, than it is to build an act based on universal truths. An act that will be just as enjoyable to listen to 50 years from now as it is today. Very few comics have ever done that. Richard Pryor has done that in many moments. George Carlin has, Billy Connolly, Bill Cosby. I know Bill the Man, cringy as fuck now, but some of his early albums about his family, they are about as universal as stand-up gets. Anyway, the list is small. Now let's look at the state of theater in Shakespeare's time and place, get a feel for the world that brilliant mind sprang forth from. Shakespeare wrote plays during the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages. Simply put, these were the periods during the reigns of Queen Elizabeth I and King James I. The Elizabethan age began on November 17th, 1558, when Queen Elizabeth I took throne after her half-sister Queen Mary I died from illness at the age of 42. Queen Elizabeth, like Queen Mary, one of the daughters of the infamous King Henry VIII, that dude who was married 6 times and had 2 of his wives executed, right? Off with their heads. And the dude who broke England away from the Catholic Church when the Pope would not grant him an annulment, which kicked off all sorts of Catholic versus Protestant bloodshed in the UK for centuries going forward. His daughter Elizabeth was Protestant. Mary was a Catholic. Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London by her sister due to suspicion of supporting Protestant rebels. She was worried her sister was coming for her Iron Throne. It was some real Game of Thrones shit. Queen Mary was known as Bloody Mary by English Protestants. During her brief 5-year reign, she had over 280 religious dissenters burned at the stake. Burn the witch! In this case, just being a non-Catholic Christian in her land during her reign was grounds for being either imprisoned or killed. Then when Elizabeth became queen, the anti-Protestant madness ended and was replaced by anti-Catholic madness. While your basic Catholic wasn't burned at the stake and they were instead imprisoned and or fined, their priest, if caught, was often beheaded or executed in some other manner. A large portion of Shakespeare's plays were written during the Elizabethan period, and perhaps the fractured society he lived in helped him write tales such as Romeo and Juliet, right? The Montagues and Capulets at each other's throats in a fight for political supremacy of one family, similar to how the Protestants and Catholics were at each other's throats in Shakespeare's day. The Jacobean age, Jacobus meaning James in Latin, is the name of the artistic period during the reign of King James I, from 1603 to 1625. In that period, considered very similar to the Elizabethan age. The persecution of Catholics continued, and connecting this to our witchcraft suck from a few episodes back, literal witch hunts were common during both these ages. Shakespeare was surrounded by people being tortured and killed for nothing more than gossip and superstition. Shakespeare's most famous tragedies were written during the Jacobean age, the last 10 years of his career. Also, King James, who was Bloody Mary's son, was that King James, as in the man who commissioned the King James Version of the Bible, first published in 1611, the most widely published book in the history of the world. Pretty crazy that the most printed author of all time, William Shakespeare, his works have been printed over 4 fucking billion times, and the most printed book of all time, the King James Bible, printed between 5 and 7 billion times, come from the same place and the same time. Right? They're both coming out of essentially London, where both of them are based in the same period of time, within a few years. Very strange coincidence. But back to burning the witches, providing an escape for many from the insanity of witch hunts and the plague. Plague outbreaks were common in London during Shakespeare's day, something else he had to deal with. And other madness like wars and just, living a typical shitty 16th or 17th century life was the theater. Melissa Thomas from Cedar Crest University, an expert on the theater culture of early modern England, writes, long before the invention of modern technologies, such as radios and televisions, movies, video game systems, and the ever-popular internet, people in the Elizabethan age created an elaborate system of activities and events to keep themselves entertained. Anyone poor or rich could go to the theater to watch plays, but it was mostly the poor who went. Members of the upper class disapproved of how the poor had access to the theater. It was also used as a place for sex workers and their customers to maybe go on dates or to, get some dates. And because plays were performed in the afternoon, people had to leave work, which the upper class also frowned on. I wonder how many members of the upper class who disapproved of peasants not working had literally never worked themselves in their lives, thanks to the money they were born into. Disgusting how the lazy, unruly, and downtrodden masses waste their slovenly lives at the theater. They should be working and making something of themselves. And another thing, where's my fresh pot of tea? Where's the shortbread I asked for 20 minutes ago? How am I supposed to sit in my pleated leather chair and complain about the lazy poor in my mansion in front of the fire if my servants don't keep me full of tea and shortbread? Everyone's lazy, and my feet are cold. Where's Martha? I need my blanket adjusted. Many theaters were not actually located in London. They were built on the south bank of the River Thames, just outside the city. That was because the city had strict regulations against theaters since 1575 due to plague outbreaks and unseemly behavior. And I will say theaters back then, they were pretty fucking unseemly. Thanks to a real problem in London and the surrounding areas with poop, with peanut butter. This is so fucking gross. London in Shakespeare's day had about 200,000 people living in the city. No modern plumbing. Just think about that. There's 200,000 people living in urban conditions, and they don't have plumbing. No indoor plumbing. Best case, You had like a privy or a cesspit in your home, a little pit dug beneath your toilet, and you were supposed to have these pits emptied out by this brotherhood of sewage removal professionals known as gong farmers, toshers, rakers, night soil haulers, and more. Their job was to shovel out the shit from your privy or cesspit, dump it into a hand-drawn or horse-drawn cart, and then carry the shit out of the city and sell it as fertilizer. And they were doing this back when hand sanitizer and hot showers did not exist, when fucking no one had a Glade plug-in. Well, not everyone could afford to have these dudes keep their privies and cesspits clean, and so their shit, literal shit, excuse me, would back up and sometimes overflow into, say, a neighbor's basement or living room. Think about just like tipping an outhouse over in your neighbor's living room. Or they'd illegally have their pits funnel out into a ditch or some creek or the River Thames. And not everyone even had a privy or a cesspool. So they would have, best case, a chamber pot, and they would shit and piss into that, or just an old wooden bucket, and then they would just dump that literal bucket of shit into the street or the river or just wherever they could sneak off and dump it without getting caught and fined. Imagine how London smelled, just in general, on a hot summer's day. And early theaters, right, the context of all this shittiness, no designated bathrooms. And apparently this is true. I looked in so many sources, I'm like, this has got to be a fucking nonsense. But I guess not. People would just piss anywhere they felt comfortable pissing, oftentimes in like, especially the general seating area of the theater, where there wasn't assigned seating. It was like more like a standing area, like the pit. Many, maybe on the back wall of the theater, maybe one of the buckets or chamber pots, they would just toss around for that exact purpose, like during shows. Maybe they would step outside of the theater, piss in the river, or against an exterior wall of the theater. The Globe Theater, built in 1599 by Shakespeare's acting company, Lord Chamberlain's men, had an area we might call the pit today. Big area directly in front of the stage, had no seats. It was, for people who couldn't afford seated tickets. It was cheaper, unreserved tickets. And people standing for the entirety of the production, they were called groundlings. They might just stand and piss there, hopefully into a bucket, while the play is being performed. And if nature dialed an extra number when she called, they might just shit in that bucket as well. Like a theater of people all tearing up as Juliet, realizes Romeo is dead. And maybe one teary-eyed groundling who just is having some stomach problems is also taking a dump. Right? Just, oh, happy dagger, this is thy sheath. Oi! Who just cut thou turd of such stink? My heart bleeds for my Romeo, and my eyes burn from the shit of some groundling, for fuck's sake. And extra fun, all this showbiz was happening a few centuries before the advent of toilet paper. They would use an assortment of stuff to wipe their asses. Maybe some moss, maybe an old rag, tree leaves, cabbage leaves, tea leaves, pamphlets, and other scraps of paper that came from a book other than the Bible. And that's not me adding commentary. According to some sources, that really was the only paper that was off limits, the Bible, for ripping up and wiping your ass with. And sometimes, and I really wish I was making this up, they would use their fucking shirt sleeves. If they didn't have anything else handy, or they just wouldn't wipe at all. What the just don't wipe. How is wiping shit on your shirt sleeve better than just leaving it on your ass? I mean, I guess you're not going to get a rash, but fuck, the smells. And these dirty savages would just keep standing there in their filth, watching a little bit of Hamlet or whatever. Ugh, feeling real grateful to be alive today right now. So grateful. Too bad Shakespeare can't get in a time machine, come from the 16th century up to now and be like, oh, this is how people were supposed to watch my shows. While the bathroom situation wasn't very sanitary back then, the content of the productions themselves was sanitized to a degree. The theaters were censored by the Office of the Revels, presided over by the Master of the Revels. The Office of Revels was dedicated to reading play manuscripts before they were performed, removing any material deemed offensive or unseemly. Make sure there wasn't any witchcraft bullshit snuck into the script, right? Make sure no jokes are being made at the expense of the king, or that the material wasn't too anti-Catholic or anti-Protestant or anti-whatever was fucking you're not supposed to be against at that time. Who worked at the Office of the Revels? What kind of killjoy was eager to do some censoring? And how different would some of Shakespeare's plays be now if he hadn't been censored? Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? How I long for your prick, your meat spindle. your inflated fiddle to pierce the tender recesses of my bikini burger for the very first time. Hail, Lucifina. I mean, maybe bikini burger wasn't vaginal slang from the correct era. It just makes me laugh, though. I can't remember hearing bikini burger as a euphemism for vagina before this week. That kind of shit probably would have played well for the crowds of Shakespeare's day. Much of the audience was dudes. Upper and lower class women, also visitors to the theater, but not as common. Wealthy women, the least common attendees. When they did show up, they typically wore masks to hide their identities because it was frowned upon for women of a certain status to watch performances, although Queen Elizabeth herself loved the theater. And when I say Queen Elizabeth, I do want to make it clear that I don't mean the recent queen who died in 2022, because I can see how that would be confusing. She would be Queen Elizabeth II, but I want to make that clear because due to her very advanced age towards the end of her life, I could see how some of you might think that she was born in the 16th century. So most of the audience was men, and all of the actors were men. The performances, real sausage fests. As many of you most likely learned in your high school English classes, women not allowed to perform for centuries. According to a lecture by Lawrence Senelik, professor of drama and oratory at Tufts University, from the dawn of time, women's presence in the theater has been the exception rather than the rule. The theater is grounded in religion, and having women on stage was not considered decorous. Their realm is the home. And staff writer Ken Gewurtz once wrote for the Harvard Gazette, the irony is that the religion from which ancient Greek theaters sprang up was the worship of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, whose rites were carried out principally by women. But when these rites evolved into theater, women were banished from the stage and their parts taken by men. The Greeks believed that allowing women to perform publicly would be too dangerous, and that having men portray them neutralized the danger. So dangerous to let women perform publicly. They might be seen as overtly sexual. They might say things in the play that people think they really believe, controversial things. Women were not allowed to perform until later in the 17th century, just after Shakespeare's time, when female opera singers started performing. And even then, many still didn't approve. Pope Clement XI said, "A beautiful woman who sings on stage and keeps her chastity is like a man who leaps into the Tiber and keeps his feet dry." Ah, man, what a fucking weirdo. So dangerous. Performing a passionate role, perhaps playing a character with a romantic relationship or interest in another character, inevitably leads to that devil pussy getting wet. That chaste bikini burger getting all moist. The horror. Now a few words on how the theater was evolving in England before and during Shakespeare's day. In England in the early 16th century, just before Shakespeare's time, there were two types of theater in England. Small groups of professionals who performed in various halls, inns, and markets, taking gigs wherever they could get them, or groups of amateur actors who sometimes performed for the royals or assorted gentry just for funsies. By the second half of the 16th century, some of London's professional acting troupes had become quite popular and were able to remain in London for performances instead of taking their dog and pony shows out on the road. In 1576, when Shakespeare would have been 12, professional thespian, theatrical producer, and now theater builder James Burbage establishes the theater. That's actually what it was called, the theater. The first successful permanent space dedicated to performing plays in London. And the first true theater of any kind in England since Roman times. It sat just outside of London, due again to the mayor of London banning plays due to concerns about plague outbreaks. Another theater, the Red Lion, had been built just before the theater, but didn't even last a year before shutting down. So Burbage's theater would last until just after his death, which ended his lease in 1598. So they had a nice 26-year run. James' son, Richard Burbage, Dickie B, baby. No Dick Quest, but still a fine dick. Will go on to be Shakespeare's greatest actor. More on that dick later. More theaters will be constructed in the years following the opening of the theater. Being able to have a dedicated year-round theater, hosting production after production, just like what happens on Broadway in New York or the West End in today's London, or in theater districts in virtually every major city in the world. That is now a thing in Shakespeare's London, which greatly helps him. Most stages during the Elizabethan age in London were platforms, sometimes as large as 40 square feet in the middle of a yard, surrounded by mostly standing or only standing spectators. Platforms were usually raised 4 to 6 feet, had a roof, which was called the shadow or the heavens. The roof was meant to conceal an area where production objects, set decorations, were raised or lowered. At the back of the stage was a multi-leveled facade with 2 large doors at stage level and a space for discoveries of hidden characters. Few props would be used during performances, and larger props usually stayed on stage throughout the play. Oftentimes, actors didn't spend much time rehearsing, usually only received their personal lines. Play productions clearly a lot more raw back then. Or maybe people were a lot better at memorizing lines back then than they are now. Back when they lived in a world where fewer people had access to books, no one had access to the internet, so you couldn't just easily look something up when you forgot it. Because of a lack of rehearsals compared to today, some of the most important scenes in plays usually involved just a few characters, and often just one character dominated the scene. The less back and forth dialogue, the easier to get the production up and running. Female roles were performed by boys or young men, which is why in many of Shakespeare's plays, women are not the stars and often do not remain on stage for very long. And hopefully, the boys weren't too young. I'm having some weird visuals right now in my head, like a production of Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo is played by some large, beefy, fucking 30, 40-year-old bearded dude, and then Juliet is played by a waifish, baby-faced, 11-year-old boy. Just a bit cringy. Despite being more simplistic than today's productions, Elizabethan plays did have special effects such as smoke, cannons, fireworks, and flying entrances, where actors would be rigged up to the roof area. It's pretty cool. They were able to do that back then. Stages also had trapdoors that allowed ghosts to rise from the graves. And of course, productions evolved to incorporate cooler stage tricks and become more polished as more theaters sprung up, providing more of a true scene for actors and set designers and theater carpenters, producers, etc., to work on their craft, right? Where they pushed each other to get better and better. In some theaters, a wall covered by a curtain separated backstage from the dressing room. This was called the arras. The theater's overall shapes were round, square, or octagonal, and typically had thatched roofs that covered part or all of the space above the audience. Spectators could usually either stand in the yard, sit on benches, sit in a private box, or even sit on a stool on stage if they had enough money. And that is fucking weird. I wonder if the actors hated that. They must have. Right? It makes me think of performing a stand-up set with some, king shit VIP literally on stage with me. Someone who paid so much, I can't just have them kicked out if they get too rowdy or disruptive. No, thank you. I can see that setup leading to some actors really losing their shit. I have to spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on... Would you shut the fuck up, Jonathan? Do you really have to piss in a fucking bucket on the stage right now, you piece of shit? It's the middle of my pivotal soliloquy. Theater performances were usually about 3 hours long. Plays were performed each day with different plays, performed every day. Theaters put up flags on performance day and occasionally put a picture up advertising the next day's play. Black flags were used for tragedies, white for comedies, and red for histories. Why the colors? Well, because people were largely illiterate back then. A lot of these audiences were also obnoxious assholes. Audiences typically were not quiet during performances, which sounds horrific to me. They would talk throughout the entirety of the play, often arrive late, and leave whenever they wanted to. They would interrupt actors, yell at actors, sometimes get up on stage and insert themselves into the play. And the whole throwing Rotten Tomatoes thing, that is not made up. Some audience members would actually bring rotten vegetables to throw at performers. As someone who's been a traveling performer for the majority of my life, what a fucking nightmare. The theater crowd that Shakespeare produced his works for, not at all like the theater crowd today. Etiquette has thankfully improved dramatically in the past 400 years. And audiences are showing a lot more respect for the works of Shakespeare now than they ever did in his lifetime. Pretty sad that the audiences that watch Shakespeare's works today are just so much better than the audiences he actually saw in his lifetime. Let's now discuss a brief overview of his writing style. Shakespeare was a creative genius who, like all creative people, genius or not, was inspired and influenced to some degree by the authors who came before him. For example, historical characters written about in Chronicles by Raphael Holinshed, published in 1577 when Shakespeare was 13, very likely directly inspired the plays Macbeth and King Lear. Chronicles was a collaborative work that covers British history. Raphael Holinshed was an English chronicler, most known for writing chronicles, makes sense, tracts. His work became a source that helped inspire many dramatists of the Elizabethan era. Shakespeare was also inspired by ancient Greek writers like Ovid and Seneca. Cardenio, one of Shakespeare's lost works, most likely based on parts of Don Quixote, Cardenio, or the history of Cardenio, and Love's Labor 1 are both considered by many to be Shakespeare's lost plays. There may have been others that we just have not found references to. With Cardenio, I think I was saying Cardenio, we know based on historical documents that the king's men performed it. We just don't know its contents. It likely had something to do with the character Cardenio from Don Quixote. Same for Love's Labor 1, except some think this was an alternate title for one of Shakespeare's known plays. So maybe that was not an extra play. Now let's go full fucking high school literature class and blow spitwads at the teacher when he or she is writing on the chalkboard with their back towards us. Or let's talk about iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is the name given to the rhythm that Shakespeare used in his plays and sonnets, a rhythm he did not invent, by the way. It was a poetic writing style already popular in England during his day. He just made it famous. The rhythm of iambic pentameter is like a heartbeat, with one soft beat and one strong beat repeated 5 times. An iamb is a foot or beat that consists of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed symbol. Right? Example words, delight, the sun, I guess that's not a word, that's 2, forlorn, one day, release. Penta means 5 meters, so iambic pentameter means 5 feet or 5 sets of stressed syllables and unstressed syllables. A popular website dedicated to everything Shakespeare, No Sweat Shakespeare, writes, putting these two terms together, iambic pentameter is a line of writing that consists of 10 syllables in a specific pattern of an unstressed syllable, followed by a stressed syllable, or a short syllable, followed by a long syllable. One example from Shakespeare's writing is, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? I guess that's some version of that is how they say it, but they'd make it sound a lot cooler than I just did. Iambic pentameter was popular during both the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages. According to No Sweat Shakespeare, iambic pentameter is a basic rhythm that's pleasing to the ear and closely resembles the rhythm of everyday speech or a heartbeat. In addition to having a pleasing rhythm, Shakespeare also was a fabulously entertaining writer, tragedy, comedy, or historical play. He knew how to keep his audiences crying, laughing, or at least, interested in what they were hearing and watching. He had a little bit of Lucifina in him. Hail Lucifina. Shakespeare's audiences were often laughing, interjecting, and shouting at the actors because his plays were full of sexual innuendos that he managed to sneak past the master of the revels. Here's some examples from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 2. Lady, shall I lie in your lap? No, my lord. Do you think I meant country manners? Did you think I meant country matters? I think nothing, my lord. That's a fair thought, to lie between maids' legs. Well, during the Elizabethan era, nothing was slang for pussy. And country was pronounced with a lot of emphasis on the first syllable, so cunt-ry. So, talking about puss there, meat sacks. Hamlet talking about getting in and out, and in, and out, and in, and out of Ophelia's bikini burger. Here's more hot and steamy Elizabethan era sexiness from the poem Venus and Adonis. Graze on my lips, and if those hills be dry, stray lower, where the pleasant fountains lie. Oh, fuck yeah, bro. Eat my puss! And from Titus Andronicus, Act 4, Scene 2. Thou hast undone our mother. Villain, I have done thy mother. Throwing in a little, I fucked your mom reference back in the late 16th century. From the 12th Night, Act 2, Scene 5. By my life, this is my lady's hand. These be her very C's, her U's, and her T's. And thus make she her great P's. During the Elizabethan era, this line would have been read as her very C's, her U's, instead of and in her T's. So, cunt. As in, again, bikini burger. A little more about Sweet Willie's naughty style now, and then we'll hop into his timeline. Shakespeare's early plays were written in the conventional style of his time, which means they were written with elaborate metaphors and rhetorical phrases that didn't always align naturally with the story's plot or characters. Over his career, Shakespeare adapted this traditional style. He incorporated the metrical pattern consisting of lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter, also called blank verse, that we just went over. And there are passages in his plays that deviate from iambic pentameter and use simple prose. Shakespeare wrote between 37 and 39 plays from approximately 1590 to 1613. The most common themes of his plays were histories, tragedies, comedies, and tragicomedies. Most of his plays were histories. Plays like Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3. Dude had a fucking trilogy. Just like film franchises so often do today, Henry VI was his very own Back to the Future franchise, or something like that. He also wrote Richard II, Henry V. All these plays focus primarily on the actions of corrupt rulers. Julius Caesar was meant to showcase the drama and chaos of Roman politics, which may have been relevant to the times because of Queen Elizabeth I. She had no heirs, leaving the throne open and conflict inevitable, a topic undoubtedly on the minds of his audience members. Shakespeare also wrote comedies like A Midsummer Night's Dream, Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, and Twelfth Night. Shakespeare transitioned to tragedies after 1600, writing classics like Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. Hamlet, aka the Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, one of Shakespeare's most well-known plays, exploring darker elements of human nature. Hamlet is still considered among the most powerful and influential tragedies in the English language, with a story capable of seemingly endless retelling and adaptation by others. It's been adapted into over 50 films and counting. I personally love the 1996 version with Mel Gibson, Glenn Close, Helena Bonham Carter. She is fantastic. During his final period, Shakespeare wrote tragic comedies like Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. The Tempest has been made in numerous films and inspired many others, including the awesome sci-fi thriller Ex Machina. Now it is actually time for the timeline.
Strap on those boots, soldier. We're marching down a Timesuck timeline.
Despite how prolific of a writer Shakespeare was, like I mentioned earlier, we don't know a lot about his personal life. The only official documentation of Shakespeare is church and court records. But that being said, here we go. William Zip Zap Shakespeare was born on April 23rd, 1564. His middle name is usually not mentioned because it sounds just pretty silly today. But Zip Zap was a super common middle name in England in the mid-16th century. People who had it typically went by Zippy or Zappy. It is thought that Shakespeare's closest friends and family did know him as Zippy Willie. And that is nonsense, of course, but makes me laugh to think about it. Makes me laugh to think about the greatest playwright in the history of the English language being a dude commonly known as Zippy Willie. What was actually common when and where William was born was not to have a middle name. There are actually no birth records for Shakespeare, but the parish register of his local church states that he was baptized at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, April 26, 1564. The origins of that church, built in 1210 CE on the site of an even older church. More than 200,000 people a year now visit that church because of Shakespeare. It's believed that based on Zippy Willie's baptismal date, he would have been born 3 days earlier, which would have fit baptismal traditions of England at that time. So born on April 23rd, 1564. Stratford-upon-Avon, located over 90 miles northwest of London, according to biography.com. It was a bustling market town along the River Avon and bisected by a country road. Historians think it would have taken Shakespeare, traveling by stagecoach, about 3 days to make the journey between Stratford and London. What a different time. Now, if you have a car, drive above the speed limit, and drive above the speed limit a bit like the average person, you can knock that journey out in less than 2 hours if you don't hit too much traffic. The first residents of the Stratford area were an Anglican tribe called the Wiche, a Germanic tribe that settled in the area after the Romans left. The settlement was absorbed into the Anglo-Saxon kingdom around the 6th century. That's when it's got its name. First written Anglo-Saxon reference to Stratford occurred between 693 and 717. The town was named 8 Stratford, the Isles of the Ford. According to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, presumably it was the establishment of the Holy Trinity Church that drew written attention. So the original church may have been built, a long time before 1210. The small settlement at the time consisted of a church, a monastery, a watermill, and a community of about 20 families. And then Danish raiders, fucking Vikings, destroyed all that in 1015 while doing some literal raping and pillaging in the area. What a terrible time to be alive. At some point during the 11th century, the Holy Trinity Church was rebuilt with stone and then rebuilt again in 1210. During the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, residents of Stratford lived under the feudal system. The settlement became a planned town with gridded streets and houses on narrow plots of land. Around 1269, the Guild of the Holy Cross took municipal responsibility for the city and would remain in control until 1547. The Guild was the central institution of Stratford's civic and cultural life, which catered for the town's spiritual needs and fulfilled a range of political and social functions, such as building and maintaining a hospital. A number of historical buildings associated with the guild still survive today. In the early 14th century, John de Stratford became the first Stratford resident to attend university. He graduated in 1311. He would eventually become the Archbishop of Canterbury and donate money towards paving the streets and church renovations back in Stratford-upon-Avon. When the Guild of the Holy Cross was abolished in 1547, following declining membership thanks to all of the religious and political turmoil and uncertainty in England at that time, right? Fucking Henry VIII's mess. The town had no local government for the next 6 years. Shit got Wild West. The guild system was then replaced by what was called the corporation. Sounds terrible. The townspeople took ownership of guild property, and the town once again became self-governing under authority of the crown, of course. A group of 28 local bigwigs ran the show, kind of like a city council today, Due to a lack of records, not totally clear how they were elected or exactly how they ran things. Many Stratford residents at that time, now we are in Shakespeare's time, relied on the wool trade and sheep farming. Stratford was a regional center for the processing, marketing, and distribution of various sheep products. It's a fucking classic sheep town. Stratford was considered a very economically successful town. A lot of good wool. So many good sheeps. By the time old Zippy Willie was born, Stratford would later go on to experience further economic growth in the 18th century, mostly due to Shakespeare's reputation. By the end of the 1700s, Stratford already becoming a tourist town. In 1769, actor and playwright David Garrick organized the Shakespeare Jubilee, the very first festival celebrating Zippy Willie in his hometown. In the 19th century, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust was established, which provided cultural capital to attract more tourists. And now, Stratford is the second most visited location in all of the UK. London is number one, right? And then Stratford is number two. Approximately 2.7 million people a year visit Stratford. That's fucking wild. One guy still making all kinds of people all kinds of money. Just, hundreds and hundreds of millions, probably billions of pounds, 4 centuries after his death. A little over 30,000 people now live in this town, and only 3 or maybe 4 of them are able to make a living without hanging off of Zippy Willie's nuts. And that is a quote from the Stratford Shakespearean Economic Society, or would be if that society existed. But for real, tourism is far and away the leading provider of jobs in Stratford-upon-Avon, all due to one dude. In a very real way, Shakespeare built that city, not Starship, like they claim in their 1985 chart topper. And that's a corny 80s rock reference, if you're confused right now. Let's transition back to Shakespeare. Shakespeare was the third child of John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. John and Mary had 8 kids. Sadly, their first 2 daughters died as infants, which made Shakespeare their third progeny, their oldest living child. Shakespeare's sister Joan died a few weeks after being born, and his sister Margaret died at the age of 1. Man, watching your first 2 kids die before the age of 2. It's fucking brutal. I do not wish that on anyone, but it was common back then. It was the norm at this time, really. Like, you were the anomaly if, 1 or more of your kids didn't die during childhood. Shakespeare had 5 younger siblings. His brother Gilbert was born in 1566, died in 1612. Joan, 1569, died in 1646. Anne, born in 1571 and died in 1579. Richard, gotta love the nonstop suck first dick parade, born in 1574, died in 1613. And Edmund, born in 1580 and would die in 1607. Records suggest that Gilbert was a haberdasher and might have spent most of his time in London. There's a record of a haberdasher named Gilbert Shakespeare in St. Bride's, a church on London's famous Fleet Street. Fleet Street's been around since Roman times, now famous for having some of England's oldest banks, finest hotels, and became known for printing and publishing towards the end of Shakespeare's life at the start of the 16th century. By the 20th century, most British national newspapers operated from Fleet Street. In Shakespeare's day, a haberdasher was a person who sold small articles for sewing, dressmaking, and knitting, such as buttons, ribbons, and zippers. Later, it became a term for someone selling men's clothing, specifically suits. Joan was the only sibling who would outlive Shakespeare. She married a hatter named William the Hatter Hart, in the 1590s. All these old-timey jobs. I love it. Haberdashers and hatters. Luckily, none of the Shakespeare clan had to work as a night soil hauler. And night soil might be the best euphemism I've ever heard for poop. You feeling okay, Joe? I am now. Had to pump out a little night soil earlier. Feeling way better now. William's brother, Edmund, was a London actor. He died at the young age of 27, and it's believed Shakespeare paid for his funeral. Too bad we don't know how good he was at acting. There are no records of how captivated or not audiences were with his performances. That would suck to be fucking Shakespeare's brother and just be a shit actor. Always, playing fucking Bush number 6 in a production. William's father, John, was a glove maker and a political figure in town. He served different civic positions, which gave him an elevated status. And that status allowed him to send his kids to the local grammar school for free. And I love that glove making, just gloves, no other articles of clothing, was a true craft with practitioners all around England going back to at least as far as the mid-14th century. They made gloves from the skins of sheep, does, horses, goats, as well as from satin, silk, velvet, and worsted. Gloves were popular as gifts and featured in wills as presents for mourners. So-called chicken skin gloves were also a thing. A set of chicken skin gloves. It's got to be a lot easier to find a chicken skin duffel bag right now than it is to find a pair of chicken skin gloves. You get it. Chicken skin gloves were actually made from the skin of unborn calves. Yeek. And check out this level of decadence. Check out this level of don't give a fuck. Right? This is back then. These nasty-ass gloves were popular with royal women for a time because they were so ridiculously thin, smooth, and delicate. A total status thing. Like an Elizabethan version of Armani or Prada or Rolex. The sign of getting a legit pair from a true master of their craft was if it passed the walnut shell test. And that meant a pair of these chicken skin gloves could be folded down into a shape so tiny it would fit into a little walnut shell. And these gloves were so delicate, they were meant to only be worn either a few times or just once. Because trying to wash them would destroy them. Little random glove trivia for you today, right? So they would just fucking take some not quite born fetus and let's fucking kill it so we can make a couple gloves that can be worn one time. I'm sure you were hoping to beef up on your Elizabethan glove knowledge with this episode. Now a bit about Zippy Willie's mama. Mary Arden was a daughter of a farmer from the village of Wilmcote. She was most likely born between 1536 and 1538, the youngest of 8 kids of Robert Arden, old Bobby A, a member of the Guild of the Holy Cross. When Mary's father died, she inherited a significant amount of land and a little over 6 pounds, which is roughly equivalent to around 4 billion pounds today. No, 30,000 pounds in modern money. About 40,000 bucks, maybe. Very hard to rely on inflation calculators for reliable currency translation from, that long ago. Mary was between 19 and 21 when she married John. And there's some evidence that Mary knew how to read, which wasn't rare exactly for a woman at that time, but many women were illiterate, since schools for girls would not arrive in England until the 17th century. And she was mentioned as the executor of her father's will. Now back to Papa John. Better sonnets, better night soil. Papa Shakespeare. John Shakespeare was most likely born in the 1520s. He was the son of a farmer, Richard Shakespeare. Fucking cool. Another dick for the suck stew. From the village Snitterfield. Old Dick S. from Snitterfield. About 2 miles from Stratford. John moved to Stratford by 1552 at the latest on April 29th of that year. He had to pay a fine of 1 shilling for creating a midden heap, a muck heap, in the street. Apparently he threw his literal shit, out into the street in a way that ran contrary to some kind of local ordinance. Like maybe there was a designated night soil disposal area on one side of the street, and he just flung his turds on the other side. John purchased property in 1556 on Greenhill Street and Henley Street, where Shakespeare would be born 8 years later. John married Mary Arden the following year in 1557. Owning a house made him a man worth marrying. In 1556, John was appointed to the civic position of ale taster. That was a common job back then. Still loving all these old-timey jobs. An official ale tester tasted the ale and bread made in a town to make sure that the locals weren't eating or drinking anything moldy, rotten, or just, especially not good for whatever reason. They made sure certain standards were being held so the locals weren't being ripped off and to prevent the town from getting a bad reputation amongst outsiders. I think of them as beer inspectors, beer and bread inspectors. This position led to more civic positions for John, such as chamberlain, constable in 1558, alderman in 1564, and high bailiff, basically mayor in 1568. John was also one of 22 glove makers in town. 22 glove makers in a town of about 2,500 people. That's one glove maker for over 113-ish people. Gloves were fucking hot in Stratford. You either had some sick-ass gloves, you either rocked that sweet chicken skin, or you were a bare-handed fucking loser. Go lay down in a ditch and die, you naked-fingered fuck. Can't afford a new pair of calf fetus hand warmers every time you leave the house? How do you keep waking up every morning when you're so poor and pathetic? In addition to being a local glove maker, John was also a widower and made his own leather with deer, horse, goat, sheep, and hound skin. Hound skin! My God. Okay. Would you like some hound skin shoes? No, I don't want some fucking hound skin shoes. It's fucking horrific. John was also a wool brogger in his spare time, which was an unlicensed, illegal wool dealer. Wool dealing was restricted to state-approved wool merchants after a 1553 Act of Parliament. The crown wanted a piece of every wool shilling made in the kingdom. But Johnny S. wasn't going to wait on no government to give his sweet-ass permission to make his fucking wool. Don't tread on me, motherfuckers! No one tells Johnny calf feet his fingers if he can or cannot make his ass some wool. John made a killing with black market wool. He actually did. From 1571 to 1572, he sold approximately 5,600 pounds of illegal black market wool. What a funny item to be on the black market, by the way. I picture some guy in an alley with a cart of so much wool behind him. Just, psst, hey, over here. You want in on some of these mittens? You're not going to find a better sweater for a better price than this sweet, sexy shit I got right here. Come on, bro. Let me pull the wool over your eyes. You know you want this quilt. John had to go to court in 1572 for illegal wool purchases. Following this, he was done with local government, and he stopped going to council meetings. If they weren't going to let him make his fucking wool cash, fuck them all. John started mortgaging some of his land now, starting with a 48-acre purchase, which indicated the beginning of his money problems. He still had the sheep, just couldn't make cash off them anymore like he used to. They cut off his, his fucking wool dollar flow or whatever. Now the gloves aren't paying the bills. The local market is flooded with gloves. You can't throw a fucking rock without hitting some schmuck working on some chicken skin gloves. In 1592, John fails to appear in church because of his debts, which I knew exactly why that kept him out. Maybe embarrassment, or maybe literally not allowed to go to church until he paid back some debts. I don't know. However, it seems like he was able to turn things around because in 1596, John was awarded a coat of arms. More on that coat of arms later. We have very few records about Shakespeare's childhood and education. According to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Mary Arden would likely have told young Shakespeare fables and fairy tales, like a typical English mother, an English mum, would do for her child. That's what folks did there when he was little. These childhood stories will be referenced in some of Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare also would have read, like other children of his day and age, or at least other male children, the Bible at home. At the age of 7, he attended Petty School, where he learned the alphabet, numbers, and 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer. And this was typically written on parchment and made into a so-called horn book. A horn book was a single-sided alphabet tablet, which served from medieval times as a primer for study and sometimes included vowel combinations, numerals, or short verse. From 1571 to 1579, ages 7 to 15 for Zippy Willie, Shakespeare likely attended the local grammar school called the King's New School, which had been established by King Edward VI a few decades before to offer free education to boys in Stratford. There are no written records of his attendance, but it would have been, unusual for him not to have attended that school, especially considering how literate he went on to become. According to Lois Potter, former English professor at the University of Delaware and Shakespeare aficionado, while the school's records during Shakespeare's childhood no longer exist, references in his play suggest he knew all the basics that boys would have learned at grammar school. For example, in Much Ado About Nothing, the character Benedick says the line, "What? Interjections? Well then, some be of laughing, as ha-ha, he-he." This comes from a section of the William Lilly's grammar book that teachers in England were supposed to use. School taught reading, writing, and the classics. Shakespeare would have learned and spoken, and written Latin at this school. And he would have studied classic Latin authors, or authors in Latin. Students also expected to speak Latin to each other during recess and at home. Shakespeare most likely left school at the age of 14 to begin a 7-year apprenticeship until his coming of age. There are no records of Shakespeare attending university. As mentioned previously, Shakespeare lived with his family in a house on Henley Street until he was 18. If he did begin an apprenticeship around that time, we don't know what it was. Johnny Shakespeare owned the house Zippy Willie was born and raised in for approximately 50 years. The house served as a family residence and his glover's shop. John worked on the east side of the building and had a barn and workshops outside where he did his dirty, illicit wool trading. About 20 years after the house was constructed, a 2-room cottage was added where Shakespeare's sister Joan and her husband William would live. Apparently, there were only about 10 fucking names back then to pick from for dudes. Right? We got William, we got Richard, and we got a couple more. John left the house to his oldest daughter, Susanna, when he died. Willie's sister Joan continued renting the house. Susanna left the house to her daughter Elizabeth. Elizabeth had no kids, so the house went to the descendants of Joan Hart, and the Harts owned the Henley Street house until the late 18th century. The house eventually went up for sale and was purchased by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which is great, so it can be preserved. Shakespeare's birthplace went up for sale in 1847. The Henley Street property was divided into 3 entities: the Swan and Maidenhead Inn, a butcher shop, and a tenement. The entire building was owned by Anne Court for a time. Anne's husband, Thomas Court, had restrictions in his will on how the property could be sold. The will stated that after Anne's death, the house had to enter a public auction. And when it did go up for auction, there was so much interest, as you can imagine, from people like Washington Irving, Charles Dickens. By the 1830s, the Royal Shakespearean Club was involved in the restoration of Shakespeare's bust and grave at the Holy Trinity Church. The club was already discussing the idea of buying the house before the sale was even public knowledge. They then established the Shakespeare Birthplace Committee and intended to buy the property with a bunch of pooled money. The committee was divided between Stratford and London. One of the London members was Charles Dickens, arguably the most famous English author next to Shakespeare. The committee needed to raise enough money to buy the house as well as have enough additional money to properly restore and maintain the property. The Henley Street house went up for sale in 1847 with an auction scheduled for September 16th. There were rumors that P.T. Barnum was going to purchase and ship the house to New York for a fucking theme park. So glad that never happened. Does Shakespeare really scream theme park? Do we really need to be able to eat massive ice cream sundaes, huge sodas, overpriced hot dogs while waiting in line for some Much Ado About Free Fallin'? Some roller coaster ride? The Tempest Underwater Adventure! Romeo and Juliet's House of Horrors. The committee posted pamphlets and flyers to ask for donations and were able to raise £3,000 by September 16th to purchase the property. Highest offer was £2,100 until the Stratford and London committees gave their bid letter offering the £3,000 and won the auction. After they purchased the property and started restoration, the committee changed their name to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which has been a big source for this episode. The trust still works today to preserve the house as much as possible so visitors can experience what it was like during Shakespeare's time. So thank you, Dickens. And based on tourism numbers, I'm going to say that they have some seriously deep pockets now and do not have to worry about needing to sell the property anytime soon. And if they did, I have no doubt that the British government would claim and maintain the property. November 28th, 1582, 18-year-old Shakespeare now marries 26-year-old Anne Hathaway after they had already started fucking for sure. So much prick and bikini burger action. Anne Hathaway will outlive her younger husband by over 7 years. She lived from 1556 to 1623, dying at the age of either 66 or 67. A little confusion there since we know the year, but not the day or month of her birth. We actually know very little in general about her. Most of what we know comes from old legal records. We know that Anne was from Shottery, a little village near Stratford, about a mile away, that long ago was absorbed by Stratford. The home she grew up in, now called Anne Hathaway's Cottage, 12-room farmhouse, has also been preserved, thankfully. Also by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. They bought it in 1892. Anne was sometimes called Agnes. She grew up less than 1.5 miles from Zippy Willie. Her dad was a farmer, and he left her a sum of money in his will so she could get married. According to that trust, William and Anne might have done a hand fasting ceremony before their official wedding. Hand fasting was usually done on August 1st, Lammas Day, a harvest festival. And hand fasting was an unofficial wedding. It's kind of similar to giving somebody a promise ring today, maybe a little more serious. It would have been a pledge to get married. Anne was 3 months pregnant when she married Shakespeare, a couple in a rush to get officially married before she started to show. Shakespeare submitted a marriage application to the bishop's court in Worcester. 2 farmers from Shottery went with him to serve as guarantors for the £40 fee they would be required to pay if their marriage was found to be invalid. William was still considered a minor at that time, and was legally required to have permission from Anne's father to marry her, because the age of legal adulthood was 21 back then, which surprises me for some reason. It's younger now than it was then. Her early marriage also meant he could not legally complete his apprenticeship if he even was in one. So many rules back then. Shakespeare's marriage license allowed him to get married outside of Stratford-upon-Avon. There are 2 documents within the Worcester oh boy, diocesan archives that confirm William and Anne were married in November of 1582, but the documents don't say where exactly they got married. Bond dated November 28th. There was only one reading of the bonds, which was an announcement of the upcoming marriage that would allow people to raise objections. That was usually done, 3 times in the 3 weeks leading up to the wedding. And has anyone ever been to a wedding where someone actually did object? Or is that only in the movies? I don't think I know anyone who has witnessed an actual marriage objection. That would add a lot of entertainment value to the wedding if that did happen. Some scholars believe that the two only married because Anne was pregnant, but that's just speculation. They might have been perfectly happy. William and Anne would be married until William's death for 34 years. On May 26, 1583, Shakespeare's daughter Susanna is born and then baptized. Scholars believe that Susanna went on to receive a private education and, therefore would have been able to read and write. While there still wasn't, proper schools for girls yet, you could hire a tutor to give your daughter an excellent education if you had the money, and they for sure had the money. Susanna Shakespeare will marry physician John Hall at the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, June 5th, 1607. February 2nd, 1585, Shakespeare's twins, Hamnet and Judith, are born and baptized. Hamnet and Judith, named after family friends, Hamnet and Judith Sadler. Tragically, Hamnet dies of unknown causes at the age of 11. Fucking brutal. That actually seems worse, maybe, than losing a child under the age of 2, right? Still so young, but also old enough to have really developed a strong identity. So you can start to see what kind of adult they were becoming. So many more years of bonding. Hamnet was buried in the Holy Trinity Churchyard, August 11th, 1596. And many Shakespeare scholars believe that the speech of the character Constance in the play King John reflects Shakespeare's pain at losing his child. From King John Act 3, Scene 4, grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief? Fare you well. Had you such a loss as I could give better comfort than you do. I will not keep this form upon my head when there is such disorder in my wit. O Lord, my boy, my Arthur, my fair son, my life, my joy, my food, my all the world. Man, that pain is the fucking pain that scares me the most. It scares me so much more than, like my own inevitable death. The pain of losing a child. My heart truly goes out to parents who have experienced that fucking horrific tragedy. Also, Hamlet obviously pretty close to Hamnet, and many think Shakespeare named the tragic protagonist, after his son. In 1616, the year of William's death, 31-year-old Judith will marry 26-year-old Thomas Quinney, the son of a prominent local family. This was a big scandal because Thomas's lover, Margaret Wheeler, had given birth to his child just a month after the wedding. And then both Margaret and her baby would die during childbirth. Thomas was sentenced to perform penance before the congregation for 3 Sundays in a row because of this. He also had to donate 5 shillings to the poor. Okay. Hey, dickhead, you knocked up some poor peasant girl you never intended to marry and she died giving birth to your bastard. You're in big trouble, motherfucker. You have to say sorry 3 times over the course of 3 weeks and cough up 5 shillings. Backing up a bit now. Shakespeare completely disappears from historical records for the 7 years following the birth of his twins in 1585. Called the Lost Years by scholars, there are many theories about what was going on, during this time. The main theory is that Shakespeare went into hiding after poaching from local landlord Sir Thomas Lucy. Shakespeare allegedly poached deer off his Sir Thomas's estate. I guess I could have said his estate. I don't know why I was trying to do his's. I don't think that's the thing you ever say. Whose is that? Oh, that's his's animal. That's his's property. You gotta stay off of his's property. Anyway, he allegedly poached some deer off this guy's estate called Charlecote Park and then fled the city to avoid punishment after getting caught. And if you're thinking he fled for 7 years over poaching, seriously? That's what I thought as well. I thought, how much trouble could you get in for shooting a deer on the property of some local noble? Well, it turns out quite a bit. A lot. A common punishment for poaching in England in the 16th century was to have your fucking ear cut off. Yeah, mutilation. I would go into hiding as well. The next most popular theory is that Shakespeare left to go work as an assistant schoolmaster in Lancashire. John Aubrey, a noted English historian and author born a decade after Shakespeare's death, wrote in 1681 that Shakespeare was a school teacher in the country. Others believe Shakespeare worked as a lawyer's clerk or as a soldier, or he may have been running the family business of glove making. And then there is the true crime theory I've teased out a few times, the Billy Shakes theory. In the late 1580s, young women living in both Stratford and London began to go missing. And then in the early 1590s, when women kept going missing, now some of their bodies started to turn up. Very mutilated bodies. Someone possibly a glove maker, or someone who may have been a glove maker's apprentice, someone very skilled with a sharp knife, had skinned their hands perfectly, as if the skin was being used as a really macabre glove. And this same sick fuck carved words into the stomach of at least one victim. Much ado about Satan. Sound familiar? Finally, one of the women was still alive when she was found, and her dying words were Billy Shakes. Pretty suspicious. And this is almost never mentioned in the sources. Why? Maybe it didn't happen. Or maybe the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust has been working for decades to erase it from the historical records. Moving along now. Historians believe that Shakespeare was definitely living in London by the mid to late 1580s, and maybe killing. He may have worked initially as a horse attendant at some of the London theaters, tending to the horses of those who rode them or rode a carriage pulled by them to the theater. Horses who pissed and shit just outside the theater, while theatergoers pissed and shit inside the theater, and also outside the theater. So much night soil to be hauled. Again, so thankful to live in a world full of indoor plumbing. Seriously, I know I complain a lot about this or that, just like any other meat sack, but we do live in amazing times. There's evidence that by 1592, Shakespeare was working as an actor and playwright in London, had already written several plays. The September 20th, 1592 edition of the Stationer's Register includes a reference to Shakespeare from another playwright named Robert Greene. The Stationer's Register was a publication of the Stationers' Company of London, a trade guild given a royal charter in 1557 to regulate the various professions associated with England's publishing industry, including printers, bookbinders, booksellers, and publishers. The company's charter gave it the right to seize illicit editions of published works and to bar the publication of unlicensed books and allow publishers to document their right to produce a particular printed work in the register, which thus constituted an early form of copyright law. So they're working on, protecting intellectual property back then, which is cool. Robert Greene was an English prose writer who died in 1592. He was considered Shakespeare's most successful predecessor in blank verse romantic comedy. And he was one of England's first professional writers and one of the earliest English autobiographers. And in a way, one of England's earliest theater critics. Greene wrote about Shakespeare, "There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. And being an absolute Johannes factotum, in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country." Scholars differ on how to interpret all that shit. The general message is that Greene was saying that Shakespeare was reaching above his rank, not fucking staying in his lane, not knowing his place, in an attempt to match other playwrights who were more well-known than him. So maybe this guy was jealous. According to Britannica, this quote appears in the book Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit, bought with a million of repentance, 1592, which was published after Greene's death. A mutual acquaintance of the men, interestingly, prefaced the book with an apology to Shakespeare, which indicates that Shakespeare had powerful friends in the industry by the time of that book's publication. Greene is most known for the plays Goonies, Predator, Total Recall, Gremlins, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and The Lost Boys, all of which were adapted to films in the 1980s. No, none of his plays had even close to the longevity of Shakespeare's works. 0 of them have made an impact on modern pop culture. I would love it if somehow the fucking Lost Boys was written in this Shakespeare's time in England. In the early 1590s, Shakespeare is thought to write the first of his plays we know today, Henry VI, Part 1, Henry VI, Part 2, Henry VI, Part 3. The Two Gentlemen of Verona and Titus Andronicus. Historians debate which play was written first. Shakespeare's first printed works would be sold in the early 1590s, 2 poems instead of plays. Venus and Adonis in 1593 and The Rape of Lucrece in 1594. Here's the first stanza from Venus and Adonis. Even, I don't know why I want to read all these in a weird voice, but even as the sun with purple-colored face had ta'en his last leave of the weeping morn, rose-cheeked Adonis tried him to the chase. Hunting he loved, but love he laughed to scorn. Sick-thoughted Venus makes amain unto him, and like a bold-facted suitor, gins to woo him. Probably sounds cooler when a Shakespeare expert reads it. And here's the first stanza of The Rape of Lucrece. Her lily hand her rosy cheek lies under, cozening the pillow of a lawful kiss. Who, therefore angry, seems to part in sunder, swelling on either side to want his bliss. Between whose hills her head entombed is, where like a virtuous moment she lies, to be admired of lewd, unhallowed eyes. Dark poem, literally centered around a Roman noblewoman being raped. Dark crime stories, popular now, and they were also then. Also, does that poem add more credence to the Billy Shakes theory? I mean, who writes about rape? Anybody could. But would a rapist be more likely? A serial killing, hand-skinning rapist. While the original primary sources have been erased from the record somehow, secondary sources say that Billy Shakes likely was continuing to kill in London and also in Stratford. Bodies kept turning up in both places. Bodies missing the skin on the women's hands. Both those poems were dedicated to one Henry Rossley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton and a patron of Shakespeare. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust writes, to succeed at any artistic project in Tudor England, you would need a patron. A patron was a wealthy aristocrat who could find you work and support some of your living needs. The reason patrons were so crucial was because it was equally important for an artist to have a reputation amongst elite high society as it was for them to be talented. Writing plays would not be enough to ensure Shakespeare his reputation in the competitive world of Tudor England. The only way to achieve this reputation was to have someone who was a member of the nobility to vouch for you. Well, luckily for Zippy Willie, it was considered fashionable for the nobility to vouch for and support artists. Quoting that Birthplace Trust again, it was the aim of most of the elites to gain political power by situating themselves or their family members in the royal court. And how was one to attract the attention of the queen and her courtiers? By being the epitome of the current culture. And there was another way it was useful for nobles to support artists. The theater was the general public's primary form of entertainment during this time, which would give the nobility a way to influence them, a large audience, right? Have their playwright make favorable references to them and unfavorable references to their opponents. Spin, baby, right? Get the narrative you want out there to the people. Henry Rossley came from a Catholic dynasty, which was controversial in England at that time, as we went over earlier. By the 1590s, Catholics not in favor in England. Rossley's father would be caught helping Jesuit Edmund Campion escape capture to avoid being executed. Henry's father would then be imprisoned in the Tower of London for a year and a half for his involvement in all that. And Henry would be raised by Queen Elizabeth's chief minister, Lord Burghley, to prevent him from being corrupted by his Catholic father. And he became a member of the royal court. Rossley loved literature, and Shakespeare used this to his advantage to secure his patronage. Shakespeare addressed his poem, Venus and Adonis, to the Right Honourable Henry Rossley, Earl of Southampton, Baron of Titchfield. And then in 1594, he dedicated The Rape of Lucrece to Rossley as well. The love I dedicate to your lordship is without end, whereof this pamphlet, without beginning, is but a superfluous moiety, the warrant I have of your honourable disposition, not the worth of many untutored lines, makes it assured of acceptance. What I have done is yours. What I have to do is yours, being part in all I have devoted yours. Were my worth greater, my duty would shew greater. Meantime, as it is bound to your lordship, to whom I wish long life, still lengthened with all happiness. If I could have your lord's cock in my mouth every moment of every day, I would suck upon it. I don't know. He's just really fucking kissing his ass here. If you were wondering exactly what all that meant, I have no fucking idea. Seemed to really get superfluous there with all the, ass kissing. Shakespeare scholars also argue that his reference to a beautiful boy in his sonnets were references to Rossley. Right? Even the legendary Shakespeare had to kiss some ass to get his name in the history books. In 1594, the Lord Chamberlain's Men is formed. After an outbreak of plague, Shakespeare and other actors from various companies formed the Lord Chamberlain's Men under the patronage of, not surprised, Lord Chamberlain, a.k.a. Henry Carey, 1st Baron Hunsdon. Shakespeare would be a partial owner or shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's Men, as well as an actor and a playwright. I keep forgetting Zippy Willie was also an actor. He is thought to have worked as an actor for 15 years. Was he any good? We don't know. They didn't push record on the video camera. But if he did it for 15 years, he probably was pretty good. He was said to favor kingly parts, with legend having Hamlet's father as his farewell role, fitting for the father of Hamnet. His acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, arguably the most important company of players, aka actors, in London and in all of the UK, if not in all of Europe during the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages. An earlier incarnation of the acting company, a group of traveling thespians called the Hunsdon's Men, also patronized by Henry Carey, First Lord Hunsdon, can be traced from 1564 to 1567. Hunsdon became Lord Chamberlain in 1585. Another Lord Chamberlain's Men company was under his patronage and traceable up to 1590. Then in 1592, London theaters closed down for well over a year due to fucking plague, all these plague outbreaks. They reopened in 1594, and a good deal of reorganization and amalgamation between various theater companies took place. A new version of Lord Chamberlain's Men emerged from this reorganization. After Chamberlain died in 1596, the company, patronized now by his son, George Carey II, Lord Hunsdon. The company was renamed Hunsdon's Men a second time until Carey became Lord Chamberlain in 1597. The company went back now to be known as Lord Chamberlain's Men, and until King James I would take the throne in March of 1603, and then the company would fall under royal patronage and were renamed the King's Men. They'd gotten so popular, the king was like, I want them. Give them to me. They're mine now. And the king got what he wanted. Imagine if current leaders, not just the guy in North Korea, could do that kind of shit. Right? Just here in the States. I like Amazon. Bezos, give thy business to me. I like Stephen King. He now writes for the king. I like the Marvel cinematic universe. It's mine now. It's the King's cinematic universe. The King's Men company, their only rival would be a company known as the Admiral's Men, later renamed Prince Henry's Men. And the Admiral's Men were the acting company that produced the plays of Shakespeare's most noteworthy contemporary, but really a predecessor, Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was London's most esteemed playwright right before Shakespeare. He died young at the age of 29 in 1593, and he was the first to make a name for himself in writing blank verse, unrhymed poetry, often in iambic pentameter. And no one quite knows how he died. On May 30th, 1593, he had dinner with a man named Ingram Frizzer. A fight supposedly broke out between the two men over the bill, and Marlowe ended up getting stabbed to death over it. Some fucking argument over dinner. But plenty don't think that happened. Too much to get into here. Some think he faked his death, then began writing under the name of William Shakespeare. But there's not any proof of that. Past the timing of his death and some style similarities to the bard. Back to Lord Chamberlain's Men, Shakespeare was the company's regular dramatist and wrote an average of 2 plays a year for about 20 years. Throughout his career, Shakespeare wrote 38 plays, or 37, or maybe 39, and at least 2 narrative poems, 154 sonnets, and assorted additional poems. And none of Shakespeare's original manuscripts exist today. The actors of the King's Company, what Lord Chamberlain's Men again evolved into, will collect his plays for publication after his death, and they were published in the first folio, the first collection of his work, that contained 36 plays, but no poetry. And then later publications will include poetry and a couple extra recovered plays. Shakespeare's first plays believed to have been written before or around 1592. In 1598, writer Francis Mears publishes a positive review of Shakespeare. His acting is not mentioned, but his writing is. Because of this review, we know that by this time, Shakespeare was well known for his work and had produced at least a dozen plays, including the classics Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, Love's Labour's Lost, Richard II, and Titus Andronicus. The Lord Chamberlain's Men had one of the best actors in London, Richard Burbage, fucking Dick Burbage, Dickie B, son of James, pioneer of London theatre building. Dick lived from 1567 to 1619, and according to contemporary records, he was the first actor to play the role of Richard III, Romeo, Henry V, Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, and King Lear. Born 3 years after Shakespeare, he would also die 3 years after Shakespeare. The Bard's Brad Pitt, his Al Pacino, his Denzel Washington or Leonardo DiCaprio or whatever leading man you prefer. By the age of just 20, Richard was already a very popular actor. He was a member of the Earl of Leicester's company and remained with the company through its absorption into the King's Men Company. Also a shareholder in the Globe and Blackfriars theaters. More about the Blackfriars Theater a bit later. Richard was a very in-demand actor and performed not just in plays written by Shakespeare, but also plays written by others. When Shakespeare died, he left money and some of his possessions to a few friends, starting with Richard Burbage. And Burbage came from a family of performers. In addition to his dad being a producer and theater builder, his brothers were also actors. They were truly a theatrical family. To live is to be part of the theater. According to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Shakespeare would write some of his most famous leading roles, such as Richard III, Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, and Prospero, just for Burbage. The two men often performed together on the stage and even lived near each other in Shoreditch in the East End of London and would inspire and motivate each other, collaborate together. Burbage was the Robert De Niro to Shakespeare's Martin Scorsese, the Beavis to Shakespeare's Mike Judge, the Ernest P. Worrell to Shakespeare's John Cherry. Forget those last two comparisons. The Lord Chamberlain's men were so renowned, they performed 170 times at court for Queen Elizabeth I and King James I during Shakespeare's lifetime. Now back to Zippy Willie's pals. Another friend of William Shakespeare's was Hamnet Sadler, right? We mentioned him earlier, his late son's namesake. These two likely grew up as friends. Hamnet's family lived very near the Shakespeares in Stratford. They both got married, had kids around the same time. And Shakespeare, as I said earlier, named his twins after Hamnet and his wife Judith. So very good friends. Hamnet spent his life in Stratford-upon-Avon and would die in 1624 and was recorded as a witness to Shakespeare's will. Another one of Shakespeare's friends was Ben Jonson, noted dramatist, poet, and literary critic, considered the second most important English dramatist during the reign of James I, next to Shakespeare. Most known for his plays Every Man in His Humor, The Silent Woman, The Alchemist, and Bartholomew Fair. The Alchemist is one of the very few non-Shakespearean plays of this era that is still performed pretty commonly, and publicly, obviously. Back to Shakespeare's acting company. From the summer of 1594 to March of 1603, the Lord Chamberlain's men stayed in London in the fall of 1597. They did a little provincial tour. Then in 1603, they traveled outside of the city during an outbreak of plague in London. It was successful enough that the company went on tour in the summer and fall almost every year after that for a while. And it seemed like they were celebrated pretty much wherever they went, right? In the days before the internet, TV, radio, they were in many ways the closest thing to rock stars that 17th century England had. All the world's a stage, and we are its finest performers, you motherfuckers. Backing up a bit, starting in the fall of 1599, when not on tour, the company moved to the Globe Theatre, constructed by Richard and his brother Cuthbert Burbage, following the death of their father James and the subsequent loss of the lease that ended the run of his performance space, the theatre. The owners of the company, called housekeepers, shared the profits of the productions they held. Acting companies were always looking for new material to perform and usually paid freelance writers on a piecework basis, also known as a task basis. Shakespeare, though, not a freelancer, because he was a shareholder in the company, and wrote his plays for the company. We don't know what cut he got, but we know he received, a decent percentage of profit for the plays he wrote that were performed at the venue he partially owned. Probably a pretty fat cut considering how much land he will buy towards the end of his life, as we'll learn soon. Most acting companies didn't want to sell their plays to publishers, especially if they were popular. Some companies sold their plays when they disbanded or were forced to shut down due to, again, the plague. Can't believe how much the plague was constantly disrupting the theater scene, or when their plays were no longer popular. Once a writer sold their play to a company, they no longer had intellectual property rights to it. That reminds me of how big television and film studios used to operate decades ago, right? They'd contract actors, actresses, directors, writers, etc., to only work for their company so that none of their competitors could profit off of their talent. Now it's different. Now a show creator might create a show for Netflix and sell their next show to HBO, then the one after that to Sony, or fund it themselves to their own production company to sell to, whoever. Plays were usually published in a quarto, large piece of paper divided into 4 pages, double-sided, 8 pages in total. Some plays printed in octavo, which was 16 small pieces of paper. So very important back then to be concise with your words. You only had so much paper to write it all out on. About half of Shakespeare's plays were printed in quarto. Some of the other plays issued in unauthorized volumes. If this happened, the acting company would then commission an authorized version. For example, a title page from a copy of Romeo and Juliet from 1599 called the Second Quarto states that this version is newly corrected, augmented, and amended, as it hath been sundry times publicly acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants. Circle back now to Shakespeare's family. Explain that coat of arms his dad got. As mentioned previously, in 1596, John Shakespeare granted a coat of arms. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust writes, during this time of increasing social mobility, a coat of arms was an essential symbol of respectability, and they were highly sought after. It has been estimated that William might have paid as much as £20 for it. Between 1570 and 1630, there were 45 men with the title of gentlemen in Stratford, which meant they had an official, crown-sanctioned coat of arms. The term gentleman denoted a status in the class system, that of a man who is entitled to bear arms, though not ranking among the nobility. So just one step kind of in between the nobility and the peasants, the gentlemen. Total population was 2,200 per 1595 records in Stratford, and 28 were born gentlemen, 17 applied for and received the title. So only 45 total gentlemen out of the, 2,000 plus people. After receiving the title, the Shakespeares displayed their coat of arms above the entrance to their home, set it into windows, and carved it into furniture. They were fucking proud of that shit. Super big deal socially. And financially, since it lifted their status in the eyes of other people with more money, got them more business. The grant documents shows a drawing and description of the coat of arms says gold on a bend, diagonal bar, sable, black, a spear of the first, so gold, steel, argent, with a silver tip, and for his crest a falcon, his wings displayed, argent, which is silver, standing on a wreath of his colors, supporting a spear, gold, steeled as aforesaid, which is actually reference to more silver, set upon a helmet with mantles and tassels. The motto that goes along with the coat of arms is non sans droit, which is French for not without right. To get an official coat of arms, you had to go through a very formal application process, submit your claim application to the required amount and the required amount of money to the College of Arms, headed by the Earl Marshal. Think of it kind of like a posh Department of Motor Vehicles, a bureaucratic institution that handled and still handles granting new coats of arms, genealogical research, and the granting of various pedigrees. You would submit design element considerations, and then the College of Arms will make the actual design, making sure your coat of arms doesn't match some other family, making sure it looks regal and proper enough, has the right symbolism, etc. All this sounded a bit too pompous to me at first, but I guess if they didn't do that, some idiot, some fucking Derek Skeet mullet would eventually toss up a coat of arms made of an eagle with a dick for a head, shitting on a hedgehog, or, I don't know, fucking just a bunch of huge tits all woven through the coat of arms. Just, oh, shit, yeah! Check out how fucking sick my new coat of arms looks. Moving along to 1597 now. By 1597, Shakespeare had written and published 15 plays, maybe, probably, difficult to date. Most scholars have reached a general consensus for the plays written from 1588 to 1601, 1605 to 1607, and from 1609 onward. 1597, one Shakespeare for sure purchased New Place, the largest house in Stratford, for £120. The glove maker's son, now the fucking biggest fish in the Stratford pond. Recently discovered archaeological evidence from New Place shows that Shakespeare split his time between Stratford and London, and in his final years spent more time in Stratford than scholars initially thought. Shakespeare came home often to visit family, use his library, and of course to write, and, maybe do some other stuff. Maybe to kill. In 1597, 8 young women's bodies were found in Stratford, missing the skin off of their hands. And 6 bodies in the same condition found in East London. Carved into one of the women's stomachs were the words, "To be or not to be Satan." Very similar, obviously, to what Shakespeare once wrote. And carved into the dirt next to a few of the bodies was an apparent calling card, Billy Shakes. Back to what we now know for certain about Shakespeare. During his time in London, Shakespeare lived with the Mountjoys, a family of French Huguenots. He testified on their behalf in a lawsuit in 1612. Shakespeare is friends with Christopher Mountjoy, the head of the family, who was a successful manufacturer of ladies' ornamental headpieces. Chris was apparently wealthy, made a lot of wig money. Fucking love it. The son of a successful glove maker. Ends up becoming close friends with a guy who makes a lot of dough selling wigs. Family had a large house at the corner of Silver and Monkwell Streets in the Cripplegate ward of London. By 1598, the Lord Chamberlain's men's patrons had fallen out of favor with the Queen, and the theater's landlord, Gilles Allen, planned to cancel their lease and tear down the building. Allen owned the land, but he didn't own the building, and when James Burbage died, the lease to him became null and void, and he didn't have to renew it, so bye-bye the theater. Also in 1598, while we don't have any existing letters written by Shakespeare, we do have one letter written to him by a man named Dick Quinney, right? Richard Quinney, but again, fucking Dick. So many fucking Dicks back in Shakespeare's day. Addressed from the Bell Inn in London, and it just said, "To my loving good friend and countryman, Mr. William Shakespeare, deliver these." And he requested a loan of £30 from Shakespeare. So not a real exciting letter, but something. Shows Shakespeare had money to lend, or at least that Dick thought he did. Dick Quinney's son, Thomas, will eventually marry Shakespeare's daughter, Judith. December 28th, 1598, after the company leases a new theater location in Southwark, Cuthbert and Dick Burbage lead the initiative to take the theater building apart, load it onto barges, and ship the materials across the Thames. The company reconstructed the theater as fast as they could. Because the new site was on marshy land, they had to build a strong foundation. They dug trenches, filled them with limestone, built brick walls above the stone, raised wooden beams on top of the bricks. A lot of work. A funnel captured rainwater, drained it into the ditch around the theater, and then out into the river. And that is, of course, where a lot of people would, piss and shit. The new theater was 30 meters across, had 20 sides, which gave it a circular appearance, just like the original. The theater could hold up to 3,000 people, which may have been the same as the original. We don't have a firm number for the original capacity of James Burbage's The Theatre. The best source I could find said between 1,500 and 3,000. So at worst, the Globe was the same size as the theater, and at best, it was twice as big. In early 1599, Shakespeare personally contributed about 12.5% of the cost to building the theater, based on some records. This again gave him a share in the company profits and a share in the theater if they were ever to sell it. Officially approved playhouses and officially approved acting companies had only been around for about 5 years when the Globe was built. Lord Chamberlain's men, one of just 2 companies licensed to perform in London at that time. They had to build the Globe because they couldn't use Blackfriars, another space built in 1596 by James Burbage. Burbage built Blackfriars as a replacement for the theater when he knew the lease was about to expire, but then the Blackfriars' surrounding residents persuaded the government to ban him from using it for plays for a little while. Not sure why they did that. Blackfriars would survive James's death, but the venue was much smaller than the theater with a capacity of only about 400. At the end of 1598, before James passed, the company had already decided to build a new theater, but the Burbages couldn't fund it because their inheritance was tied up in Blackfriars, a theater space, they couldn't use. And that's what led them to form a consortium with Shakespeare and 4 actors, and then all became co-owners of the Globe. And the Globe would be very successful. So successful that by 1608, the company would have enough to also operate Blackfriars. They had worked things out apparently with the locals. And this was great because now they could truly perform year-round. The open-air Globe would sometimes have to shut down, for the coldest months of the year. Its roof did not completely cover it, didn't cover the yard, that standing room only general admission area in front of the stage, but Blackfriars was totally enclosed. Sadly, that theater will be destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. And then a version of it will be reconstructed in London in 2014, part of the rebuilt Globe Theater, now called the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse. Backing up again. By May of 1599, Shakespeare and his fellow co-owners were ready for the Globe's grand opening. Dick Burbage named the theater the Globe after the story of Hercules carrying the globe on his back. A flag of Hercules was raised above the theater with the Latin motto, Totus Mundus Egut Histrionum. I never took Latin. Meaning all the world's a playhouse. I love it, and I agree. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Shakespeare's words spoken by the magician Prospero to Ferdinand in The Tempest. Hail Nimrod! Some of the early plays that were performed there were Henry V, Julius Caesar, As You Like It, Hamlet, Measure for Measure, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. Antony. Sorry, I think I added a slight H there. 1601, Shakespeare's father John dies, and there is also a Llewellyn bodies turning up with no skin on their hands. Coincidence? A cooling off period? Hard to say. William inherits his father's house on Henley Street and leases it out to tenants. The house is then divided into two properties. One of Shakespeare's tenants was his sister Joan. The other was Lewis Hercox. I wonder what kind of deal he gave Joan. Hopefully a good one. Pretty fucked up if she had to pay rent to live in her childhood home to her brother after their dad died. That'd be, more than a little awkward. Sis, we've been over this. I only increased the rent to fair market value. If you don't like it, there are many other landlords in Stratford who would be happy to have you. Please don't make me kick you out of your old bedroom. Shakespeare buys more properties in Stratford in 1601, then purchases over 100 more acres of land near Stratford in 1602. 1603, after King James I took the throne, Lord Chamberlain's men becomes the King's men. Shakespeare will walk dressed in royal livery at King James' coronation in 1604. He's a fucking big deal now, at least in London and in Stratford. He wasn't globally popular like he is now because, communication limitations of the day, but very likely like the rock star of London now. 1605, Shakespeare purchased leases for several more pieces of real estate near Stratford for £440. These leases soon doubled in value, and he earned about £60 a year off of them. I had no idea that fucking Zippy Willie was a real estate tycoon. Shakespeare was business savvy, and some historians think that his wise investments are what allowed him to write full time. Right? If the theater had some lean months, a bad year, there's another outbreak of plague, he's okay. In 1605, Shakespeare also purchases a share of the Stratford tithes, which meant he would be buried in the chancel of the church. Chancel, or area around the altar, reserved for the burials of the most important people. And his remains still lie inside the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon today, so baptized, married, and buried there. 1608, Shakespeare's mom, Mary, dies. He has her buried at the bottom of a privy just outside of town on one of his newly purchased properties. She and Willie didn't get along very well, apparently, in his, her final years. And I guess he thought it would be funny to be able to literally shit on her from time to time. And then once she'd become one with the night soil, he apparently used her to fertilize his garden. No, that's absurd. No, she was buried in a now unknown area of the Holy Trinity Church Cemetery. Shakespeare's first grandchild, Elizabeth Hall, only one born during his lifetime, born and baptized February 21st, 1608. 1609, Shakespeare's sonnets are published for the first time. Most scholars date Shakespeare's sonnets as being written between 1593 and 1600. Shakespeare's sonnets, printed in quarto in 1609. The quarto contained 154 sonnets and ended with a long poem titled A Lover's Complaint. 126 sonnets are addressed to a fair youth, and the remaining sonnets are addressed to a dark lady. Scholars have been spending hundreds of years trying to identify these people, which has led to all kinds of speculation about Shakespeare's possible romances, sexuality, and fidelity. Some think that the Dark Lady is a nod to the women killed by Billy Shakes. By 1609, the total body count estimated to be around 43 victims. Fueling rumors of the Dark Lady being someone Willie had an affair with, back on March 13, 1602, law student John Manningham made an entry in his commonplace book alleging that Shakespeare had been unfaithful. According to Manningham, Shakespeare had overheard a woman at a performance of Richard III making an appointment to secretly meet with Richard Burbage. And after hearing that, he allegedly went to the arranged meeting place and was entertained by this woman and was at his game, i.e., getting his dick fooled around with, when Dick Burbage arrived. That source remains unverified. So who knows? Could be nothing more than gossip. Other scholars think that some of Shakespeare's sonnets suggest an attraction for men, such as Sonnet 20. But again, just gossip. Who knows if he was writing from his own point of view or taking artistic license. When he would write passages like, "A woman's face with nature's own hand, painted hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change as if false women's fashion. An eye more bright than theirs, less false in rolling, gliding the object whereupon it gazeth, a man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature, as she wrought thee, fell a-doting, and by addiction me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine by thy love and thy love's use, their treasure." I don't have a fucking clue what I just read. Maybe he just thinks that some dudes are handsome, right? I don't know. I think Brad Pitt and Idris Elba are pretty handsome. Doesn't mean I want to stroke their spindles. Sonnet 20 seems to be about love between two male friends. The sonnet has a line about one friend being equipped with one thing to my purpose nothing, and continues, but since she, nature, pricked thee out for a woman's pleasure, mine be thy love and thy love's use their treasure. There are several male characters in Shakespeare's plays: Antonio and Sebastian in Twelfth Night, Antonio and Bassanio in The Merchant of Venice, and Achilles and Patroclus in Troilus and Cressida, who also depict seemingly romantic relationships. Shakespeare also explored bending gender roles in his plays. For example, in The Twelfth Night, the character Viola dresses as a young man named Cesario, falls in love with Duke Orsino. Back then, these characters were usually played, again, by teenage boys. Interpreting any of that as proof of Shakespeare's sexuality, though, is, total speculation. If he was gay or bisexual, we'll likely never have conclusive proof of that. We don't know much about his personal life in general, let alone any potential secret life. And, his secret life also likely revolves, around fucking murder. So much fucking murder. If he was homosexual and acted on his homosexuality, he certainly kept that a carefully guarded secret. The punishment for sodomy, or buggery, as it was known, was death. Attempted sodomy was punished by imprisonment and public humiliation, and there were all kinds of other laws around sex. Not just homosexual sex either, but homosexual acts carried the most severe consequences. Circling back to his work now. Many believe that the sonnets were published without Shakespeare's consent. Supporters of this theory argue that Shakespeare would have also given the printer an authoritative text and dedication, but Shakespeare's sonnets has no dedication, and the text is full of errors. Sonnets were published by Thomas Thorpe. Some argue that Shakespeare was betrayed and someone gave the poems to the publisher, or a thief stole the poems for their own profit. Fucking bootleggers! Some believe that Shakespeare wouldn't have wanted the sonnets to be published because, again, they discuss possible sexuality, maybe a hint of attraction towards men. The author of the dedication, listed as T.T., thought to be Thomas Thorpe. I think it is Thorpe. The publisher, the begetter of the sonnets, is listed as Mr. W.H. Some argue this was Henry Rossley. Others say it was one of the people listed in the dedication of Shakespeare's first folio. Some believe the begetter is the person who gave the poems to Thorpe. So a lot of the stuff, with Shakespeare, a lot of speculation. Seems like Shakespeare began his retirement around 1612. Started spending, more time in Stratford than in London. Curiously, 11 young women's dead bodies will be found in Stratford in 1612 and 1613, missing the skin on their hands. Only 2 will be found in East London. Coincidence or not? June 29, 1613, during a performance of Henry VII, the cannon that was used at the end of Act 1 caught the Globe's Theater's thatched roof on fire, and the building was destroyed in about an hour. No one was injured except for one dude whose breeches caught on fire. He got his fucking breeches caught on fire. What a weird night for that guy. Went out to watch a little Shakespeare, came home with, burnt ass. February 1614, the Globe Theater is rebuilt. This time it is much more luxurious with a tile roof, less likely to burn, much less likely. The circular theater's roof still open in the center. Many people believe that Shakespeare died on his birthday, April 23rd, 1616. He would have been 52. Church records show he was buried in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church, April 25th. His exact cause of death unknown, believed he died of some illness as opposed to an injury or an accident. Decades later, in 1661, the vicar at Holy Trinity Church wrote in his journal, Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and it seems drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted. But that account has never been verified. Some scholars believe Shakespeare died of typhus. Very curiously, the last young woman's body with no skin covering her hands was found in Stratford the month before his death, March of 1616. Carved into her stomach were the words, Billy Shakes is sick. Also, in his will, William Shakespeare left 61 pairs of gloves, quote, lady skin gloves, to his friend Dick Burbage, along with the instructions, wear them and remember our bloody fun, sweet Dickie. Remember the pain, remember the screams, much ado about Satan. We all know the Billy Shake stuff is fucking nonsense, right? I hope all of us but like 2 or 3 people know that by now. And I hope at least one of those people never finishes this episode. That would be so fucking great if someone were to walk away from this truly believing that William Shakespeare is suspected of being a late 16th, early 17th century serial killer known as Billy Shakes. Some fucking psychopath who skinned women's hands to make gloves. And there's been a huge cover-up to protect his legacy from the truth. Hey, you know what? If fucking QAnon can get some traction, maybe Billy Shakes can. Some kind of Stratford Illuminati, situation dedicated to hiding all this to keep those tourism dollars rolling in. I picture them bringing this all up to people at work, whenever Shakespeare is mentioned. He's probably a serial killer, right? Billy Shakes. You heard of Billy Shakes? Right? Fucking skinned women's hands, over 60, carved words into some of their stomachs. The Stratford Birthplace Trust has been covering it up for centuries. Then when she walks away, people are like, what the fuck was Becky talking about? I always thought she was weird, but she's completely out of her mind. I'm probably completely out of my mind for just wanting that to happen. By 1623, a monument of Shakespeare erected on the chancel wall most likely existed that is still there today. Pretty impressive monument. That really speaks to, again, just how famous Shakespeare was. Strangely, Shakespeare's gravestone on the church grounds does not have his name on it. It has been believed to be his gravestone since 1656, located in the first in a row of graves for his family. The gravestone reads, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here, blessed by the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." All right. Shakespeare made Susanna and her husband John the executors of his will, left them the majority of his estate, the new place wherein I now dwell. Susanna and John moved into the new place after Shakespeare's death. Shakespeare probably left Susanna his papers. Historians assume that she was involved in the production of the first folio. Anne Hathaway was legally entitled to a third of his estate, but Shakespeare specifically left her his second best bed, which led to speculation that the couple was not happily married. But also, not much evidence to prove that they were having problems. Shakespeare's will stated, "Item I give unto my wife." It's spelled weird, W-I-E-F. "I give unto my wife my second best bed with the furniture." Furniture referred to curtains and the bed covers. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust writes, under medieval common law in England, a widow was entitled to 1/3 of her late husband's estate for her life or widowhood, even though it was not specifically mentioned in the will. In practice, however, most wives were mentioned, usually in terms of affection and trust, and were frequently made executrix of the will. The bequest of the second best bed, though, not in itself unusual. Wills were not places for the expression of personal feelings always. The best bed, or indeed best of any type of item, usually regarded as an heirloom, to be passed to the major heir, which would have been his daughter, Susanna. In a different article, the trust writes, in Shakespeare's time, a bed was an expensive and luxurious item generally regarded as a valuable heirloom, to be passed down the generations rather than given to a surviving spouse. In a world where social status was highly prized, people were keen to show off their wealth at every possible opportunity. It was not uncommon for the best bed to be kept in one of the rooms downstairs as a way of making sure your visitors could see how well you were doing. It's fucking weird. Got to show off your bed. Judith got the short end of the stick with the will. She received 150 pounds in a silver bowl and would receive more money if she and her kids survived 3 more years. Doesn't seem as if her relationship with her dad was strained. Likely that Zippy Willie was just concerned about her husband, who did not have a great reputation, as we mentioned earlier. In November of 1616, Judith gave birth to her first son, named Shakespeare. So, probably, again, not a strained relationship. Sadly, Shakespeare and her other sons, Thomas and Richard, would all die as children. Fucking 3 kids. None of them made it to adulthood. And another dick in this episode. Every fucking 4th character is dick. Shakespeare left more money and some of his possessions to several friends, Richard Burbage, John Hemminges, Henry Condell, Thomas Combe, and Hamnet Sadler. Richard Burbage, John, not real positive on how to pronounce, Hemminges. Henry Condell received 26 shillings, 8 pence to buy mourning rings. All 3 men will name their sons William. Such a sign of respect, man. All 3 did it. According to author and Shakespearean scholar Stanley Wells, this will established an informal contract for the 3 men to oversee the first folio as well. Burbage, though, would never be part of the publication of the folio because he would die before it was published in 1619. Thomas Combe would receive a sword from Shakespeare. Anne Shakespeare died 7 years after her husband on August 6, 1623 at the age of 67. Shakespeare's 4 grandchildren will all die without heirs, and because of that, he has no direct descendants alive today. His granddaughter Elizabeth never had any children despite being married twice. Judith's 3 sons died at an early age. However, his sister Joan and her husband William Hart did have many descendants. So there are people who are related to Shakespeare indirectly. Shakespeare's first folio of comedies, histories, and tragedies, published just months after Anne's death in November or December of 1623. 5 men participated in the production. Their effort was headed by publishers William Blount and William Jaggard. Just can't have too many Williams involved in a publishing of another William's works. Actors John Hemming and Henry Condell undertook the effort to collect the 36 plays for publication, and Isaac Jaggard printed about 1,000 copies for distribution. The full title is Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, published according to the true original copies. Hemminges and Condell used original prompt books, quartos, and original notes. And this was the first printed folio that contained only plays. The folio contained the first good text of, a bunch of stuff. The plays were categorized by comedies, histories, and tragedies. About 1,000 copies are made, of which 230 still exist today. Pretty impressive for a book that old. In 2020, one of these copies in excellent condition sold at an auction for just under $10 million. Most expensive literary work ever. So if you have one laying around, you might want to cash it in. Corrections were made during the printing of the first folio, making each copy unique. Back in 1623, these folios were sold for £1 each if they were purchase bound. That was enough back then to buy 44 loaves of bread. The price went down to 15 shillings if they were unbound. And the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust owns 3 copies of the first folio. So sitting on some serious fucking cash there. 3 copies of the first folio have been stolen as well. One was stolen from Williams College, Massachusetts in 1940. One from John Ryland's library at the University of Manchester in 1972. And one from the University of Durham in 1998. Only 2 have been found. Williams College actually got their copy back the same year it was stolen. This is not a good theft. July of 2010, a man named Raymond Scott, convicted of handling a stolen copy of the first folio. Scott had a lengthy criminal record. He'd been convicted 23 times, had 3 aliases, and was in about 90,000 pounds of debt. He was arrested in 2008 after taking the folio to the Folger Shakespeare Library in D.C. and telling a tale of a Cuban officer whose mom kept the book in her home for many years. He took the book to Folger's for authentication, said his friends in Cuba gave him the book. I thought, I don't know, it's an old Shakespeare book. Maybe it's worth some money. And then the book was identified as the copy of the folio stolen from Durham Cathedral Library in 1998. The book, an early English translation of the New Testament, and a piece of a poem by Geoffrey Chaucer were all stolen, but only the folio was recovered. And Scott left the folio in Washington, went back to the UK, and then was arrested. Then in March of 2012, Raymond Scott found dead in his prison cell 2 years into an 8-year sentence. In December of 2013, a coroner ruled that Scott was murdered by the ghosts of one Billy Shakes. Or died of suicide. Or that. Shakespeare's second folio was issued in 1632 and a third folio in 1663, and worth quite a bit less than the first. An original printing of the second folio sold in 2016 for just over $177,000. Third folio worth more than the second because a fire in London in 1966 destroyed a bunch of them. Only 2 exist in private collections now, and each is valued to be at least $1.5 million. 1642, Parliament orders all theaters in London to be closed down. Why? Not the plague this time. Puritanism. Puritans had taken over Parliament, and they felt that the theater was full of, quote, stage plays representative of lascivious mirth and levity. Too much fun. Too much Lucifina. Shut it all down. Fucking Puritans. Some of the most fun-hating people who ever lived. No longer able to be used, Shakespeare's globe was destroyed in either 1644 or 1645, and the land was sold. Such a shame. Shakespeare's daughter, Susanna, dies July 11th, 1649, buried beside John at the Holy Trinity Church. Shakespeare's daughter, Judith, buried February 9th, 1662, at the age of 77. Interesting that both his daughters lived long enough to see their dad become the most famous playwright in all of England, in all the world. The most famous man, or at least most famous non-royal man in England, and also saw the entire theater industry in England completely shut down by zealots. Like, how weird. What they must have thought of the globe being destroyed and all of England now forbidden to watch performances of their father's plays. Today's book-banning zealots, right? Spiritual cousins of these Puritans. Hope more people speak up against them. 1970, American actor and director Samuel Wanamaker established the Shakespeare's Globe Trust, which would allow him to reconstruct the globe. It would take almost 30 years for them to get permission, funding, and finish historical research. And the Globe Theater would open in 1997, just one street away from its original location. As I mentioned, its sister theater, Blackfriars, reconstructed in London in 2014 on the same property. And with that, let's hop out of this historical timeline.
Good job, soldier. You made it back. Barely.
And now let's look into claims that William Shakespeare was not the guy we think of today, not the man who wrote all those amazing plays. And let's do that after a very special additional sponsor. Today's Timesuck is brought to you by Whipple Chill Shakespeare Edition. Life can be so up, you know? Sometimes you need to escape all the madness of your life and get yourself down to the theater, sink into a cozy seat, and quietly enjoy the madness of somebody else's drama. But sometimes you can't get to the theater. And on those occasions, how about you make the theater come to you with Whipple, a chill Shakespeare edition. Every can is packed with 60% drama, 30% comedy, 40% tragedy, 20% nightshade, 0% night soil, 3% bikini burger, 14% mandrake juice, 100% opium, 5% Romeo, 10% Juliet. And every can is much ado about Whipple, a chill. Bring the peaceful entertainment of the theater to you with Whipple, a chill. To drink or not to drink, that is not the question. There is only drinking. For we are such stuff as dreams are made on. And Whipple, a chill, makes those dreams so deliciously wet. Whipple's a proud subsidiary of Bear Evil Incorporated. God, sounds delicious. Wish I had a can to sink into right now. But alas, I have the question of Shakespeare's true authorship to address. Approximately 150 years after Shakespeare died, people started to question if he actually wrote his plays. This theory mostly came from the fact that there's very little info and primary sources about Shakespeare's life. The Holy Trinity Church and Stratford government recorded his existence, but, no records of his literary career. Historians now began to question how a man with only a basic education could become such a talented writer. Shakespeare never received any higher education that we're aware of, unless it somehow took place during those forgotten years. And his name, never made it into any school attendance records. How could he write poems and plays that demonstrate a mastery of the English language, knowledge of politics, laws, and of the court? Doubters now began to believe that the real William Shakespeare in historical records was nothing more than a successful businessman involved in a lot of real estate deals. Of course, other famous playwrights also have few records of their lives and also came from humble beginnings like Shakespeare. And supporters of Shakespeare, in fact, being the Shakespeare we think of today, also argue that Stratford's new grammar school would have provided a plenty good educational foundation for any writer. Also, sometimes genius just strikes people. Doesn't matter what school they went to or what family they were born into. Michael Jordan didn't have some special training in basketball that others weren't privy to. He wasn't born into some genetically superior basketball family. He was just born with a special kind of competitiveness, a certain fire inside of him that made him work his ass off to get so much better than his peers. Natural born talent, plus lots and lots of determination and hard work. Focused hard work. Shakespeare, by all accounts, by virtue of so many close friends naming their children after him as just one example, was a special dude. Maybe questions of his authorship arose because some people just can't understand that, right? Maybe because they're not that special. They're not exceptional and they have a hard time recognizing it in others. I don't know. That's just my speculation. So if Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, then who did? Some alternative Shakespearean authors proposed over the centuries are Sir Francis Bacon, Shakespeare's contemporary Christopher Marlowe, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, Sir Walter Raleigh, English poet and scholar, John Donne, and even Queen Elizabeth I. Ever since the 19th century, many people, and not just crazy people, have believed in these alternative author theories. Henry James, Sigmund Freud, Mark Twain, Helen Keller, Charlie Chaplin, many others have all doubted that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. There are thousands of books and articles dedicated to debunking Shakespeare and proposing alternative authors now. Helen Keller once wrote that whoever penned Shakespeare's plays and sonnets was a profound reader, a learned scholar, a courtier, a lawyer, and a traveler. None of those attributes match the historic facts of Shakespeare's life, Keller argued. And she surprises me here. I mean, so many people doubted that Helen could possibly be very intelligent, for so much of her life due to her being blind and deaf. But she proved them wrong. And, they thought it was, possible for someone like her to write the way that she wrote. Why would she put limitations on someone else? Why think that whoever wrote what he did has to have been this or that? Why couldn't they just been someone who, had an amazing memory or a very curious mind, talk to people who are well-traveled maybe, talk to people who are, more educated. We also don't know for a fact that he, wasn't well-read. We don't know where he was for 7 years. And we don't know what he did for most of the rest of his years since we don't have a diary or, comprehensive biography written by some contemporary. The first anti-Stratfordian theory appears in print in 1785. James Wilmot, a reverend and scholar, first formally presented the idea that Shakespeare did not actually write his plays and poems. Wilmot was also completely unknown outside of his immediate circle of friends in his lifetime. And his niece, Olivia Sayres, was the one to bring his theories to public attention, and she was a known imposter who got caught pretending to be English nobility, some princess of Cumberland. She was a fraud who spent most of her life bouncing in and out of debtors' prisons. So the whole Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare angle was launched by a known con artist. An early 19th century, Anna Delvey, a Clark, it'll be grand, darling, real Peach Melba kind of night, Rockefeller. Constance Grady, writing for Vox, has this to say about it all. The anti-Stratfordian argument is romantic and compelling. It's also based on shoddy scholarship. Most damningly, it's a fundamentally classist argument. In 1781, Wilmot attempted to write a biography about Shakespeare, maybe. He visited Stratford-upon-Avon, maybe. You'll see why I'm saying that in a little bit here. And other places Shakespeare might have visited. Searched all the libraries around the area, searched for Shakespeare's correspondence, and what he found astonished him. There was no record anywhere to indicate that William Shakespeare of Stratford ever read a book or wrote a letter. He couldn't find handwritten notes, signatures, letters, nothing. Based on that lack of evidence, he concluded that Shakespeare couldn't have written his plays. And he suspected the plays were written by Sir Francis Bacon. But again, this is just some random dude, not a noted historian or scholar or investigator, just some guy who was like, can't find a letter from anybody saying that, hot damn, Zippy Willie sure is a good reader, so therefore couldn't have wrote those plays. Boom, mic dropped. To me, this all means nothing. Wilmot never shared his ideas to a wide audience. Again, his con artist niece shared his supposed ideas. And also, allegedly, Wilmot's friend James Corton Cowell first presented this theory to others in his lectures in 1805, or maybe not. This whole thing might not be true. These supposed lectures were not discovered until over a century later in 1931, and according to Shakespeare scholar James Shapiro, these lectures most likely were made up in an attempt to support the Francis Bacon theory, which was gaining popularity at that time. These lecture notes use language that was out of fashion in the early 19th century and use information that was not known until after 1805. So the bullshit theory supposedly invented by Wilmot and spread by his niece and friend, all of that might be nonsense. All of it might have been made up over a century later by some other fucking con artists and conspiracy theorists, right? God, they have been a problem since long before the internet, manufacturing source documents for centuries. The anti-Stratfordian theory became popular in 1857 when Delia Bacon and William H. Smith published books arguing that Shakespeare was actually Francis Bacon, and the books were a hit, right? Scandals, they so often sell. Delia, I think it's Delia, not Delia, not related to Francis, by the way. Noted author Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote the introduction to the Bacon book, and then Mark Twain wrote that Bacon's book had him convinced that Shakespeare was not the author of his works. Man, a lot of smart people buying this. Why? Well, for some context, amongst the academic crowd in the mid-19th century, this was the heyday of higher criticism, where everyone was questioning the true authorship of all kinds of shit. Who really wrote the Bible? Who really wrote the classic works of antiquity? Who really wrote Shakespeare? Questioning all of this was very fashionable, very trendy. So quite possible that a lot of smart people, got swept up in that. The main basis of Delia's argument, and it is Delia, I don't know why I was saying Delia, was that how do we not know more about the personal life of a man whose works we know so much about? The disparity between knowing little about the man, so much about his work, that essentially was her main argument for Shakespeare not being Shakespeare, and that doesn't bother me, that we don't know a lot about him. Maybe he was just a private guy. Maybe he didn't care what people knew about his personal life. He wanted to let his work speak for him. Maybe he was happy letting, his fucking plays do the talking. Also, he lived well before the age of tabloids when journalists were not constantly speculating on the lives of the rich and famous. That just wasn't a thing yet. Francis Bacon and contemporary playwright Christopher Marlowe are still the main candidates for true authorship, but many other scholars suspect that Shakespeare was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. This theory was first proposed in 1920 by author J.T. Looney in the book Shakespeare Identified in Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. De Vere lived from April 12, 1550 to June 14, 1604. He was a poet, patron of the theater, in addition to being suspected of being Shakespeare. There is evidence that the Earl was known to have written plays, but no surviving examples of these plays. Looney argued that there was biographical similarity between the Earl and Hamlet, and that Oxford's poems were similar to Shakespeare's earlier works. The Earl's acknowledged poems were written during his youth, and Looney argued that these were the prelude to his work as an adult, and that his adult period started in 1593 with the publication of Venus and Adonis. Additionally, there is some interesting timing with his known work. Oxford's poems stopped being produced when Shakespeare mysteriously reappeared from his 7 lost years. Members of the Shakespeare-Oxford Society, which was founded in 1957, argue that Earl de Vere had extensive knowledge of aristocratic society and education and wrote in a style similar to Shakespeare. Again, they argue that Shakespeare didn't have enough education to write the way he did. The people who believe the Earl was Shakespeare are called Oxfordians. They argue that the Earl used a pen name because of the politically provocative nature of the plays, and he didn't want to be looked down upon by nobility for writing plays. And the theater was strange in that way. Yeah, you could be a rock star if you were, a hot actor or playwright, but also the work itself was seen as being beneath the nobility. Opponents of this theory, and there are many, note that the Earl died in 1604, and some of Shakespeare's greatest plays, like King Lear, The Tempest, and Macbeth, were published after his death. At the end of the day, there is no real evidence to debunk Shakespeare. It's all conjecture. And Stratfordians, the supporters of Shakespeare, note that there is evidence that points to his authorship, such as printed copies of plays and sonnets with his name on them, theater company records with his name, and comments from contemporaries. Why would the giant Holy Trinity Church honor Shakespeare as well if he wasn't Shakespeare? Most Shakespeare scholars do not buy into the anti-Stratfordian theory. Former Shakespeare professor Stephen Marsh wrote for the New York Times, "The idea has roughly the same currency as the faked moon landing does amongst astronauts." And finally, Shakespeare scholar Irvin Mattis wrote for The Atlantic, "There is more about Shakespeare in contemporary materials than about most others in English Renaissance theater. There are written references to Shakespeare. His name is written on plays again, and dates just don't line up with the other author candidates." So I'm going to choose to believe that Shakespeare is, in fact, Shakespeare. A man born April 23rd, 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, son of a glove maker, guy who grew up in a normal family, guy who received a good but not noteworthy education, guy who married young, had 3 children with his wife, guy who may have shared all kinds of personal details that, ended up just getting lost to history for whatever reason. Maybe they burned up in a fire. Maybe they got lost in some attic where they just rotted away. Good. Sometimes mystery is better than knowing. Just like we can endlessly reinterpret his universal timeless characters and make them relevant today, make them look how we want them to look, sound how we want them to sound, really make them our own. Well, we can do the same for Zippy Willie. Maybe Shakespeare was a fucking goofball. Maybe he was a romantic. Maybe he had a fiery temper. Maybe he skinned women's hands after fucking murdering them along the River Thames. I hope not. Maybe he was the life of the party. Maybe he was a gentle soul. Maybe he loved the spotlight. Maybe he was reclusive. Maybe he really wanted to be an epic leading man like his buddy Richard Burbage, only wrote because he didn't have the looks or voice or talent for that. Maybe he only ended up as a playwright because he was a super shitty glove maker. Who knows? What we do know is that his stories are amazing. If they weren't, they would have never stood the test of time. If they weren't, his body of work wouldn't have turned his hometown into the second biggest tourist attraction in all of England. I find Shakespeare's story so inspirational. A man who didn't come from extreme wealth, right? A guy who never went to university, a guy who just had an extraordinarily creative mind, who worked hard, wrote story after story, year after year, produced works that have inspired people for centuries. Maybe some creative type listening will be the next Shakespeare. Someone, anyone, who will make a massive mark in history in some way. Someone who will influence others for centuries to come. Right? If that's you, go get it, meat sack. Go fucking create, build that legacy. Hail Nimrod. You don't need some degree. I mean, it's great if you have that. If you've earned that degree, good for you. It is important. Education is important. But it also, doesn't mean if you don't have it, you can't do amazing things. Like write timeless plays. I love that. And now, much ado about today's top 5 takeaways.
Timesuck Top 5 Takeaways.
Number 1, we don't actually know with 100% certainty when Shakespeare was born or how he died. Historians guesstimate that he was born on April 23rd, 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon. His baptism recorded April 26th of that year. Traditionally, baptisms occurred within 3 days of birth. And historians believe he died on his birthday in 1616, probably of an illness. Number 2, Shakespeare was the primary dramatist for the Lord Chamberlain's Men, later the King's Men, for about 20 years. He produced about 2 plays a year. Among the list were classics like Romeo and Juliet, Richard III, Julius Caesar, and over 30 others. He also wrote 154 sonnets, which many believe were illegally published without his consent. Shakespeare's plays were compiled into the first folio, produced by his friends in 1623. This is perhaps one of the most important documents in literary history. Without it, Shakespeare's memory may have been lost to time, just like the exact nature of the man behind the plays has been lost. Number 3, Shakespeare had an interesting and maybe somewhat scandalous personal life. At age 18, he married a woman 8 years his senior, who was also pregnant before the wedding. There was no evidence to show that the two were deeply in love, but also no evidence they weren't. Shakespeare most likely did care for his wife Anne and their 2 surviving children and provided for them with his high-paying writing career. Shakespeare left Anne his second-best bed in his will. Many consider that a slight, considering she was entitled to a third of his estate. But in many cases, the second-best bed was actually the marital bed. However, Shakespeare didn't write about Anne with terms of endearment, as was common in wills of that time, and he didn't explicitly state that she would receive the money she was entitled to, so a little weird. Instead, his daughter Susanna seems to have inherited most of her father's estate. Number 4, Shakespeare's contemporary and friend Ben Jonson wrote that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. How true his words have been. After 400 years, Shakespeare is still widely known and studied around the world. And number 5, new info. Let's talk about some words and phrases invented by Shakespeare to further illustrate how powerfully he's influenced the English language. Shakespeare is credited with either inventing or introducing over 1,700 English words. Historians believe he invented these words by combining other words, making nouns, verbs, or adding prefixes and suffixes. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust provides an A to Z list of words attributed to Shakespeare, and here's a few examples. Alligator, bedroom, bukkake, critic, downstairs, eyeball, fashionable, finger blasted, gossip, hurry, inaudible, jaded, kissing, lonely, manager, nervy, obscene, pegging, puppy dog, questioning, rant, skim milk, teabagging, traditional, undress, varied, worthless, yelping, zany, and bikini burger. And maybe he didn't invent bukkake, finger blasting, pegging, teabagging, and bikini burger, but he did introduce the rest of those terms. Shakespeare also invented many popular phrases still used today. Too much of a good thing, from As You Like It. I have not slept one wink, from Cymbeline. Own flesh and blood, from Hamlet. It's Greek to me, from Julius Caesar. That's how they do it in Hollywood, from the Peanut Butter Diaries. Jealousy is the green-eyed monster, from Othello.
Timesuck Top 5 Takeaways.
Shakespeare has been sucked. Thank you to the Bad Magic Productions team for all the help in making Timesuck. Logan Keith producing today. The Art Warlock, Olivia Lee, did a great job for preliminary research. I had a lot of fun, going down tons of side roads and looking further into and verifying the facts that she laid out. I took a Shakespeare class in college, kind of appreciated it. Wish I would have understood then how truly historical his life was. Oh well, now I get it. It's better late than never. And how about that's enough credits today? I don't know that I need to lay them out every week. Probably not. Let's tease out next week's show. Next week, the Space Sisters have voted in the lynching of Emmett Till. Going to be a very intense episode. Emmett Till was a young black teenager from Chicago who came to visit family near the little unincorporated community of Money, Mississippi in the summer of 1955. On August 24th of that year, Emmett was standing with his friends outside a grocery store. He reportedly bragged that he had a white girlfriend back in Chicago. Maybe. It's up for debate. And his friends dared him to ask the white woman behind the counter to go on a date with him. Emmett then went to the store, bought some bubble gum, and was heard saying goodbye to the woman on his way out. Perhaps. Witnesses are kind of all over the place. Witnesses definitely don't know what happened between the two in the store. Carolyn Bryant, the cashier and co-owner of the grocery store who interacted with Emmett, would testify later that he grabbed her hand and waist, asked her on a date, told her he'd been with other white women. And she kind of changed her version of events several times over the years. And sometimes she inferred that he did much more than that with his words. Also, allegedly, Wolf whistled at her as she left the store, and that was it. Roy Bryant, Carolyn's husband, returned home from a trucking job a few days later, heard about the alleged incident, and lost his fucking mind. Thought he would seem cowardly if he didn't retaliate. So on August 28th, Roy and his half-brother, J.W. Millam, with some accomplices, kidnapped young Emmett Till from his uncle's home. Pretty interesting that for a guy who didn't want to appear cowardly, has to take a few guys with him to kidnap a 14-year-old. How is that not the height of cowardice? They drove Emmett to a farm owned by one of their family members, beat him, then took him to the banks of the Tallahatchie River, where he was shot in the head. Then the men, still not done, tied a cotton gin fan to his neck with barbed wire and threw his body in the river. Emmett's body was found 3 days later. His mother, Mammy Till Mobley, chose to have an opened casket funeral, and with that, essentially kicked off the civil rights movement. So all that, it's a big story we're going to be talking about next week on Timesuck. And right now, I have a very special Timesucker update to get into. And for those of you who do not like today's change in format, well, the regular edition of the updates will be back next week, so don't even worry about it. Big thanks to BetterHelp for partnering with us on this special segment.
Updates? Get your Timesucker updates.
Now, welcome to this special edition of Timesucker Updates. I'm going to share some advice given to me by Courtney Cope, licensed marriage family therapist and principal clinical operations manager, and David Yadish, licensed therapist and senior clinical operations manager, both at BetterHelp. I chatted with them, both, Courtney and David, at great length to ensure that this advice is in line with healthy practices for better mental health. This is not me playing therapist. No one needs that. Today, we're going to answer one of the questions we got about relationships from one of our listeners. Here we go. How do you begin your entire life over? So how do you begin your entire life over after a divorce and losing your business? As a child of divorce and someone who has gotten divorced, I know all too well how divorce can suddenly and dramatically alter your life's trajectory. There are so many emotions wrapped up in a divorce or significant breakup. The circumstances are going to be different for everyone because there are so many different reasons you and your significant other may have decided to go your separate ways. To start, allow yourself the time to feel all the feels. Have those days when you just cry. Have those days when you are super angry. Grieve the loss of the relationship and all that it represented, your partner, your friend, your family, your life plans. It's okay to feel every last feeling. You can't really move forward if you're shoving your feelings down. It can be wildly overwhelming to think about every single thing you have to start over on. Finding a new source of income, thinking about falling in love again. You can make yourself crazy thinking about all of the things you have to do all over again. And it could be overwhelming to think about all of that at once. Even if you are someone who thrives in chaos, or when your back is against the wall, there's just no way you're going to be able to do everything all at once. So it would be wise to create a plan full of small, manageable steps so that you have some short-term goals that will get you to the long-term goals. Divorce can be so devastating that even the smallest of accomplishments can feel like a massive victory. Another suggestion would be to take a vacation. And what do I mean by that? Well, if your life affords you the opportunity to break your daily routine and get out of Dodge, then step away for a few days to gather your thoughts and process those initial emotions. If that's not an option, which in this case of losing your business as well as your marriage means it probably isn't, try to break your daily routine and move things around. Can you add in a walk with a friend? Can you have lunch outside in a park for a change? Can you meditate for 5 minutes every day? A vacation doesn't have to involve travel or even a full day off. What are some small things you can give yourself that cost nothing, but will help you march forward? Can you find a song that fires you up? Listen to it every day to set the tone of your day. Create a motivational soundtrack. And keep in mind, no matter how hard this is, you will get through it. Trust yourself. Believe in your willpower to come out stronger. Find family and friends who are good sources of support. Keep the people in your circle tight. Make sure you surround yourself with positive influences. It doesn't cost anything to enjoy the beauty of what's around. Download a free app, free show, something that distracts you, makes you laugh. Focus on small moments of pleasure. Okay, I think that's great advice. And that also wraps up this special edition of Timesucker Updates. A big thank you to our sponsor, BetterHelp, and to Courtney Cope, Principal Clinical Operations Manager, and David Yadish, Senior Clinical Operations Manager at BetterHelp. Courtney Cope and David Yadish's input is general psychological information. Based on research and clinical experience, it's intended to be general and informational in nature. It does not represent or indicate an established clinical or professional relationship with those inquiring for guidance. Their feedback is in response to a written question, and therefore there are likely unknown considerations given the limited context. Also, just because you might hear something on the show that sounds similar to what you're experiencing, beware of self-diagnosis. Diagnosis is not required to find relief, and you'll want to find a qualified professional to assess and explore diagnoses, if that's important to you. If you or your partner are in crisis and uncertain of whether you can maintain safety, reach out for support. Crisis hotlines, local authorities, have a safety plan. That can be done with a therapist too.
Thanks, time suckers. I needed that.
We all did. Well, thanks for listening to another Bad Magic Productions podcast. Glad we got to do a little special ending there. Yeah, somebody who has gone through a divorce and, raised in a divorced household, married to someone else, raised in a divorced household. It's such a common experience. And it's fucking pretty traumatic. So hopefully that, gave somebody something to focus on. Little baby steps. Focus on the little victories. Don't overwhelm yourself with trying to tackle everything. But thanks for listening to another Bad Magic Productions podcast. Scared to Death and Timesuck each week, and The Secret Suck each week for space lizards. Please don't start killing young women and skinning their hands to make gloves like William Shakespeare, a.k.a. Zippy Willie, a.k.a. Billy Shakes, almost fucking certainly did. Just focus on poetry and plays and iambic stuff, which is going to help you to keep unsucking.
Bad Magic Productions.
For my summer Shakespeare theater audition, I will be reciting Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. That's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of deprised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death? The undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have, than to fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought and enterprises of great pith and moment. With this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia, nymph in my orisons, be all my sins remembered. How much fucking longer would you think Timesuck would last if I talk like that all the time? 2 weeks? 3? Have a great week, everybody. Except you. You know who I'm talking about, you fucking piece of shit. I hope your week is terrible.